There are moments in history when everything changes, yet nothing moves. No explosions, no dramatic arrivals, no lights descending from the heavens. Just a subtle shift in the fabric of reality that most people never notice. This is the story of one such moment. A moment when humanity stopped shouting into the void and realized with creeping horror that the void had been listening all along. Late October in northern Canada, the kind of cold that makes metal brittle and silence absolute. The Whitehorse Deep Space Monitoring Station sat like a forgotten monument to an earlier era of space exploration. Its white geodesic dome cracked and weathered, its parking lot empty except for a single truck with failing heating. Inside, Elliot Crane sat alone. The station was scheduled for permanent closure in 3 weeks. Most of its equipment had already been powered down, the important instruments relocated to newer facilities with better funding and warmer climates. What remained was essentially archaeological: outdated receivers, analog recording equipment, systems that had been state-of-the-art when Elliot was in elementary school. Elliot himself was an artifact of sorts, a systems technician in his early 40s who preferred the company of machines to people. He had volunteered for this final assignment precisely because it meant solitude. 3 weeks of checking systems, logging data, and ensuring everything was properly archived before the lights went out forever. It was supposed to be boring. It was supposed to be safe. On the evening of October 23rd, Elliot performed his standard overnight systems check. This involved walking through the station's main monitoring room, a circular space beneath the dome where banks of equipment hummed and clicked with the mechanical rhythm of a dying era. Most screens were dark, most consoles were silent, only one system remained fully active: the wide-band cosmic background receiver, designated Unit 7. Its sole purpose was to log random cosmic noise, the constant static hiss of the universe itself. This data served as a baseline for calibration, nothing more. It was not analysed, it was barely noticed. Until the noise stopped. Elliot first noticed it at 23 minutes past 11. He'd been reviewing temperature logs when something about the monitoring room felt different. Not wrong exactly, just different. Then he realised what it was. The white noise hiss from Unit 7's speakers had changed. For decades, that hiss had been constant, random, chaotic in the way that natural phenomena always are. But now it sounded uniform, smooth, like a single sustained note instead of static. Elliot walked to the console and stared at the display. Every frequency band showed identical activity, perfect uniformity across the entire spectrum. This was impossible. Cosmic background radiation is chaotic by definition. Radio waves from distant stars, particle collisions, quantum, fluctuations, all of it creates a random pattern that never synchronizes. It is one of the few constants in astrophysics. The universe is fundamentally noisy. But on October 23rd, at 23 minutes past 11, the universe went quiet in the most disturbing way possible. Not silent, just uniform. Elliot's first assumption was equipment failure, a stuck relay, a corrupted data stream, something prosaic and fixable. He ran diagnostics. Every system reported normal operation. Signal strength, normal. Antenna positioning, normal. Data processing, normal. The equipment was working perfectly. It was reality that had changed. Elliot sat in the uncomfortable chair, bolted to the monitoring station floor, and stared at the screens. His breath made small clouds in the poorly heated room. Outside, wind rattled the dome with a sound like distant drums. He needed to confirm the system, was actually functioning. There was a standard procedure for this, a calibration pulse, a short automated signal transmitted to check timing accuracy. It lasted milliseconds. It was not directional. It was not powerful. It was not meant to accomplish anything except verify that clocks were synchronized. Elliot initiated the pulse at 11:37. The system transmitted a brief chirp of organized radio energy encoded with timing data, then silence. Well, not silence. The uniform hiss continued unchanged. Elliot logged the calibration and turned back to his temperature reports. 8 seconds later, the noise returned. Not the uniform hiss, the real noise, the chaotic, random static of cosmic background radiation, but it returned shaped. Elliot's attention snapped to the display. The signal pattern scrolling across the screen was not random. It was structured. It mirrored the calibration pulse he had just transmitted, but stretched, layered, and harmonically complex, as if something had received his transmission and answered. Elliot's hands were shaking as he saved the data. He played it back 3 times, checking for artifacts, for errors, for anything that would explain what he was seeing. The pattern remained consistent. A response, not a reflection. The timing was wrong for that, not an echo. The structure was too deliberately altered. Something had processed his signal and transmitted a reply. Elliot spent the next hour documenting everything. Exact timestamps, signal characteristics, environmental conditions. He worked with the mechanical precision of someone trying very hard not to think about implications. At 1:15 in the morning, he composed an email to his supervisor, a station manager named Patricia Voss, who worked from an office in Ottawa and had made it clear she considered this entire closure operation a bureaucratic formality. The email was brief, professional. It included all relevant data attachments and a simple request for guidance on whether to repeat the calibration test. Patricia's reply arrived at 1:43. 4 words. Do not repeat test. No explanation. No curiosity. No questions. Just a warning. Elliot stared at those 4 words for a long time. He had worked in government contracting long enough to recognize the tone. This was not the response of someone dismissing a technical glitch. This was the response of someone who recognized something they did not want to acknowledge. He shut down his workstation and walked to the break room. The coffee was hours old and tasted like rust, but he drank it anyway, standing by the window that looked out over kilometers of snow-covered emptiness. Somewhere above that emptiness, something had answered humanity's accidental whisper, and someone in Ottawa already knew what that meant. Elliot did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the monitoring room, watching Unit 7's displays, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The cosmic background noise remained normal, random, chaotic, as if the 8 seconds of impossible response had never occurred. By morning, Elliot had convinced himself he was overreacting. Equipment did strange things. Data did unexpected things. The universe was full of phenomena that seemed impossible until they were explained. But he could not quite dismiss the flatness of Patricia's response. At 9 in the morning, ignoring the explicit instruction he had received, Elliot composed an email to someone who might actually be curious. Marcus Webb had been a colleague years ago, back when Elliot worked at a university research facility. Marcus had moved into academic signal analysis, studying radio patterns from pulsars and using them to test theories about information transmission across cosmic distances. More importantly, Marcus was genuinely interested in anomalies. Elliot's email was casual. He framed it as an interesting curiosity, something weird that happened during equipment shutdown. He attached the data. Marcus replied within 6 hours. The message was 3 sentences long. This is not reflection. This is transformation. Something processed your signal. Elliot called him immediately. Marcus answered on the second ring. Where did you get this data? The White Horse Station, background monitoring. I ran a calibration pulse and got this response 8 seconds later. 8 seconds exactly. To the millisecond. Silence on the line. Then Marcus spoke, his voice careful. Elliot, this is not noise. This is structure. Whatever generated this signal took your calibration pulse, analyzed it, and returned a harmonically evolved version. That requires processing, intelligence, or a very weird equipment malfunction. Does equipment failure usually create mathematically precise harmonic transformations? Elliot had no answer for that. Marcus continued. Have you checked historical data? Has this happened before? I was told not to investigate further. By whom? My supervisor. Another pause. That is extremely interesting. That evening, Elliot did something he knew he should not do. He accessed the station's archived logs, going back decades, searching for any mention of similar anomalies. The logs were extensive, thousands of entries documenting routine operations, equipment maintenance, calibration tests, and background noise characteristics. Most were unremarkable, but buried in the data, appearing roughly every 10 to 15 years, were brief notations that made Elliot's stomach tighten. August of 2008. Background synchronization event. Duration 4 seconds. No source identified. November of 1993. Unexplained signal uniformity. Investigated. Equipment normal. Event ceased. June of 1978. Cosmic noise collapse. Brief. Resolved without intervention. Each time the same pattern. A short period of impossible uniformity. No explanation. No follow-up. Just a note in the logs, and then nothing. The events had been dismissed because they were brief, because they resolved themselves, and because nothing else happened. Until now. Elliot printed the relevant log entries and spread them across the break room table. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Every decade or so, something caused the cosmic background to synchronize briefly. And every time, the event was ignored, filed away, forgotten. Why? Because following up would mean acknowledging something impossible. And acknowledging something impossible would mean consequences, questions, attention, much easier to log it and move on. Elliot returned to the monitoring room and pulled up the most recent data from Unit 7. The cosmic background noise was behaving normally, random fluctuations across all frequency bands. He initiated another calibration pulse. He did not ask permission. The pulse transmitted at 22 minutes past midnight. 8 seconds later, the response came. But this time, it was different. The signal did not simply mirror the calibration pulse. It evolved. The harmonic structure was more complex, the timing more precise. It was as if whatever was responding had learned from the first exchange, as if it understood better now. Elliot recorded everything. He sent the data to Marcus. He saved multiple backups, and then he waited. The response came again the next night, without any calibration pulse from his end. At exactly 8 seconds past midnight, Unit 7 registered a signal, identical in structure to the responses he had recorded, but unprompted, as if whatever was out there had decided to initiate contact on its own terms. Elliot documented it all. The signals were evolving, not words, not symbols, nothing that resembled human communication. Instead, they showed timing shifts, harmonic layering, patterns that breathed, expanding and contracting like something alive. It was communication without language, structure without syntax, as if the intelligence behind the signals did not understand sound the way humans did. It only understood structure, pattern, relationship. Marcus called him at 2 a.m. "I have been analysing the data you sent. Elliot, this signal is not coming from space." "What do you mean?" "The propagation characteristics are wrong. If this were a distant source, we would see dispersion, delay, degradation. This signal has none of that. It is appearing simultaneously across multiple frequency bands with no time lag." "That is impossible." "Yes, which means our assumptions are wrong. This is not a transmission from a point source. It is something else." "Like what?" "I do not know, but I checked something. I accessed archived data from other monitoring stations, deep-sea cable noise logs, old radio astronomy recordings. Elliot, the pattern appears everywhere. Brief moments of signal synchronization going back decades, always dismissed as interference, always ignored." Elliot felt something cold settle in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this encounter is not local. It is global. Whatever is responding has been present for a very long time. We just never noticed." That night, Elliot barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of vast patterns moving through empty space, invisible and patient, waiting for the right signal to finally respond. The next morning, he arrived at the station to find his access credentials had been revoked. The door lock blinked red when he tried his keycard. He called Patricia. She answered immediately. "Elliot, you have been removed from this assignment effective immediately." "Why?" "Equipment irregularities. Your access is a liability." "What irregularities?" "That is not your concern anymore. Report to Ottawa for reassignment." "Patricia, something is responding to our signals. You know that. The logs prove it has happened before." Silence. Then Patricia spoke, her voice very quiet. "Elliot, this station is closing. The data will be archived. The equipment will be decommissioned. Whatever you think you observed will be noted in the final report as a calibration anomaly. You need to let this go." "Why?" "Because some questions do not have good answers, and some answers do not lead anywhere useful." The call ended. Elliot sat in his truck, engine running for warmth, staring at the station he could no longer enter. 48 hours after he first noticed the signal, his entire investigation had been shut down, his access revoked, his findings dismissed, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. That evening, Marcus called with more information. "I contacted colleagues at other institutions. Everyone has similar data. Brief periods of signal uniformity. Always dismissed. Always filed away. But Elliot, there is a pattern to when it happens." "What pattern?" "It correlates with advances in global timing technology. GPS satellites, international atomic clock synchronization, fiber optic networks with microsecond timing precision. Every time humanity's technology becomes more temporally synchronized, these events increase in frequency. Why would that matter? Because maybe timing is the language. Maybe this intelligence does not communicate through meaning or symbols. It communicates through structure. And for decades, our signals were too chaotic, too random. But modern technology changed that. We created global timing standards, synchronized clocks, uniform protocols. We finally spoke in a way this presence could recognize. Not intentionally. No, but inevitably. Elliot understood then what had happened. Humanity had not made first contact through deliberate effort, not through SETI, not through carefully composed messages beamed toward distant stars. Instead, contact had occurred as an accident of infrastructure. We built systems that required precise timing, and something noticed, something that existed not as a craft or a being, but as a distributed presence, something that lived in fields, not bodies, something that did not travel, because it was already everywhere, woven into the fabric of electromagnetic reality itself, waiting, listening, until humanity finally spoke clearly enough to be understood. Elliot never returned to the White Horse Station. It was shut down 2 weeks later. The equipment was decommissioned. The data was archived in locations he did not have clearance to access. Officially, the anomalous signals were classified as equipment malfunction, interference, calibration errors. Unofficially, nothing was said at all. But Elliot kept monitoring. Not through official channels, not through government equipment, through publicly available data, radio astronomy archives, deep space monitoring reports, amateur satellite tracking forums. And over the following months, he noticed something. The cosmic background noise was changing, subtly, so subtly that most monitoring systems filtered it out as irrelevant. But it was there, faint patterns, recurring structures, harmonic relationships that should not exist in random noise. The universe sounded organized. Elliot shared his findings with Marcus, who confirmed it independently. "It is everywhere," Marcus said. "Not loud, not obvious, but consistent, as if something is actively maintaining structure in what should be chaos." What does that mean? It means we were noticed, and whatever noticed us is still paying attention. There were no sightings, no lights in the sky, no silver discs hovering over cities. Contact did not arrive in any form humanity had imagined. Instead, it manifested as awareness. Something vast and patient had heard humanity's accidental signal, and instead of visiting, instead of revealing itself, it had simply acknowledged our existence, and now it was listening. Elliot thought about this often, late at night, when the world was quiet and he could almost hear the hum of electromagnetic fields carrying signals across the globe. Humanity had spent decades broadcasting into space, hoping for a response. We sent mathematical formulas, cultural information, maps showing our location, all of it deliberate, all of it intentional, and all of it ignored. Because we were shouting in a language no one spoke. But when we built GPS satellites, when we synchronized atomic clocks across continents, when we created technology that required microsecond precision across global networks, we finally said something comprehensible. Not a greeting, not a message, just structure. And something answered, not with words, not with ships, but with attention. 6 months after the White Horse Station closed, Elliot received an unmarked envelope at his new assignment. Inside was a single piece of paper, a graph showing cosmic background measurements from multiple monitoring stations across the globe. The patterns were unmistakable now. Synchronized, structured, intentional. At the bottom of the page, someone had written a single sentence in pen. "This should not continue." Elliot kept the paper. He also kept monitoring, because the truth was already loose, not in dramatic revelations or government press conferences, but in the quiet accumulation of data, in the subtle changes to background noise that careful observers were beginning to notice. Humanity had made contact, not through intention, but through infrastructure. And whatever had made contact in return was not going away. It was embedding itself deeper into the electromagnetic spectrum, learning, adapting, waiting to see what humanity would do next. Elliot sometimes wondered what would happen when the presence decided to move beyond listening, when acknowledgement became interaction, when the patterns in the noise resolved into something unmistakable. But for now, the contact remained quiet. A presence in the static, a structure in the chaos, proof that we were no longer alone, and proof that we had been noticed by something that did not think the way we did not exist the way we did, and did not want the same things we wanted. As something that had been waiting a very long time, and was now fully aware of our existence. On a cold night in late March, Elliot initiated one final calibration pulse from a university radio telescope where Marcus worked. They waited. 8 seconds later, the response came. But this time, it did not mirror their signal. It anticipated it. The response arrived 7 seconds after transmission, then 6 seconds, then 5. The presence was learning, understanding, adapting to human timing, human patterns, human structure. It was closing the gap between signal and response, moving from acknowledgement towards something that looked disturbingly like conversation. Marcus and Elliot stared at the data in silence. Finally, Marcus spoke. "What do we do?" Elliot did not have an answer. Humanity had asked if anyone was out there. The universe had answered, not with a visit, but with attention. And now something vast and patient and utterly alien was learning to speak our language. Not because it wanted to communicate meaning, but because it wanted to understand structure. And once it understood structure, what would it do? Elliot shut down the equipment and walked outside. The sky was clear, stars scattered across the darkness in familiar patterns. Somewhere among those stars, conventional wisdom said intelligent life might exist, but the truth was closer and stranger, and it had been listening all along. We never asked if anyone was out there. We just built systems loud enough to be noticed, and the universe finally answered, not with a visit, but with attention. The question now was what came next. What happened when attention became intention? When listening became action? When the quiet contact stopped being quiet? Elliot looked up at the stars and felt the weight of all the electromagnetic signals humanity had ever transmitted, spreading outward at the speed of light, announcing our presence to a universe we barely understood. And somewhere in the fabric of that universe, something was listening, learning, waiting. The age of accidental contact had begun, and there was no going back. They told us it was the war that made men see things. Stress, they said. Fatigue. The human mind playing tricks under impossible pressure. But I know what I saw in the winter of 1943, and I know it wasn't exhaustion or imagination or some experimental weapon the Germans were testing over East Anglia. I was 22 years old, a mechanic with the 381st Bombardment Group, stationed at Ridgewell Airfield in Essex, England. Our job was to keep the flying fortresses in the air, to patch bullet holes and replace hydraulic lines, and pray the boys made it back from their bombing runs over occupied Europe. It was brutal work, honest work, and I was good at it. But this isn't a war story. It's not a ghost story either, though God knows there were enough ghosts at Ridgewell by the time I left. This is something else entirely, something I've carried for more than 30 years without speaking a word of it to anyone who mattered. My wife thinks I have nightmares about the war. My children think I'm just an old man who stares too long at the night sky. They're not entirely wrong, but they're not right either. I'm writing this down now because I found something. Documents, proof that I wasn't alone, that what happened in those woods wasn't some private madness. The British government declassified certain files in '77, buried in mountains of bureaucratic paper about radar stations and aircraft production. But there, hidden in a folder marked with codes I didn't understand, was a memo dated December 19th, 1943. The night I collapsed in the forest, behind Ridgewell Airfield. The night everything changed. I'm 84 years old now. My hands shake when I write. The doctors say my heart could give out any day, and I believe them. So this is my confession, my testimony, my desperate attempt to tell someone what really happened before I'm gone. Not because I need anyone to believe me, but because the truth deserves to exist somewhere other than my failing memory. It started with the lights. Chapter 1. The First Sight. December was always brutal in Essex. The cold came off the North Sea like a living thing, cutting through wool and leather, settling into your bones until you forgot what warmth felt like. We worked in shifts around the clock, servicing the bombers that limped back from daylight raids over Germany. The night shift was the worst, working under blackout conditions with shielded lamps that barely illuminated the work in front of your face. You learned to work by feel as much as sight, your hands memorizing the placement of every bolt and wire. It was just past 2 a.m. on December 8th when I first saw it. I was underneath a fortress, checking the landing gear for stress fractures, when Jimmy Hartwell called down to me from the wing. Jimmy was from Ohio, a kid with freckles who still wrote to his mother every week. Good mechanic, better friend. "Hey you, see that?" His voice had an edge to it I didn't recognise. I rolled out from under the fuselage, wiping grease from my hands. "See what?" He was pointing east toward the edge of the airfield where the farmland began. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the darkness beyond our work lights, the distant outline of trees against the starless sky. Then I caught it. A light, orange, roughly circular, hovering maybe 200 feet above the ground. It wasn't moving like an aircraft, no sound of engines, no navigation lights, just this steady, pulsing glow that seemed to drift slowly southward. "Weather balloon," I suggested, though I didn't believe it even as I said it. "At 2 a.m? Jimmy climbed down from the wing. "And look how it's moving." He was right. The light was executing a pattern, a slow figure 8 that no balloon could manage, especially not in the December wind that was currently making our work lights swing on their stands. 2 other mechanics had stopped working now, all of us watching this impossible thing trace its geometric path across the sky. Then it stopped. Just hung there, motionless, for maybe 30 seconds. And I swear, even from that distance, I felt something, not saw, felt, like the air itself was watching us back. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. The light shot upward so fast it left an afterimage on my vision, disappearing into the cloud cover in less than a second. The acceleration was impossible. Nothing we had, nothing the Germans had, could move like that. The human body would be crushed by G-forces from that kind of speed. We stood there in the cold for several minutes, nobody speaking, all of us staring at the empty sky where the light had been. Finally, the shift supervisor came over, a sergeant named Anderson, who'd flown missions before a flak injury grounded him permanently. "Back to work," he said quietly, "and not a word about this to anyone. Understood?" "But Sarge, we all saw—" "I know what you saw. I saw it too. But we don't talk about it. Not if you want to stay out of the stockade. The brass has been very clear about this. Anyone reporting unusual aerial phenomena gets sent for psychiatric evaluation. War nerves, they call it. You want to spend the rest of the war in some hospital being asked how you feel about your mother?" We went back to work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that light, about the way it moved with purpose and intelligence, about how it seemed to be observing us as much as we were observing it. Anderson's threats made it clear this wasn't the first sighting. Other men had seen things. Other men had been silenced. Over the next week, the lights appeared 3 more times, always at night, always executing impossible maneuvers. The pilot started calling them Foo Fighters, a phrase borrowed from a comic strip. The name made it sound harmless, almost silly. But there was nothing silly about the way those things moved, about the feeling of wrongness they left in their wake. The official line was always the same: German experimental aircraft, ball lightning, atmospheric reflections, weather phenomena, mass hallucination, brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But I'd worked with aircraft for 3 years by then. I knew how planes moved, how they sounded, how they behaved in the sky. These lights were something else entirely. On December 14th, everything changed. That was the night the bomber came back wrong. Chapter 2. The Crashed Bomber. The alarm went up around 1900 hours. A fortress was coming in damaged, requesting emergency landing clearance. This wasn't unusual. We averaged maybe 1 emergency landing a week. Birds coming back with engines shot out, hydraulics failing, half the crew wounded or dead. You learned not to think too much about the statistics, about how many men didn't come back at all. But this one was different from the start. The radio traffic was garbled, the pilot's voice tight with something that sounded like fear. Not the controlled tension of a man dealing with mechanical failure, but raw animal panic. Ground control talked him down, while we stood by with fire equipment and ambulances, watching the damaged bomber circle the field once, twice, losing altitude in an uncontrolled descent that made everyone wince. The landing was brutal. The fortress hit hard, bounced, hit again, one of the landing gear collapsing. It skidded sideways off the runway, tearing through winter grass before finally grinding to a stop in a shower of sparks and torn metal. We were running before it stopped moving, fire extinguishers ready, expecting flames. But there was no fire, just this eerie silence as the props wound down and the fuselage settled onto its broken gear. The crew door opened and men started climbing out, some of them helped by others. I counted them as they emerged. 7 men. A B-17 flew with a crew of 10. The pilot was a lieutenant named Morrison, a veteran with maybe 20 missions under his belt. He sat down hard on the grass, pulled off his flight helmet, and just stared at nothing. His hands were shaking so badly he couldn't light the cigarette someone offered him. "Where's the rest of your crew?" Anderson asked. Morrison didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Gone." "Blown out? Did you take flak over the target?" "No." Morrison looked up at him, and his eyes were wrong. Empty. They were just gone. Taylor was in the ball turret. Williams was waist gunner. Jackson was in the tail. We were over the channel, heading home. Everything was fine. And then this thing appeared. What thing? A sphere, orange, like those lights we've been seeing, but bigger, close. It came right up alongside us, maybe 50 feet off the starboard wing. No sound, no exhaust, just this light, pacing us. And then everything went wrong. The radios died. The instruments started spinning. The altimeter showed us at 10,000 feet, then 5,000, then back to 10,000. The artificial horizon was tumbling. I couldn't trust any of my gauges. The bombardier, a kid named Peters, nodded frantically. It was like the plane forgot how to fly. We started dropping, but it wasn't a normal stall. It was like something was pulling us down. The engines were still running. The props were turning. But we were falling. "And your crew?" Anderson's voice was carefully neutral. "We called back to them," Morrison said, "on the intercom. Taylor didn't answer, so I sent Peters to check. He climbed down to the ball turret and..." He stopped, his jaw working. The turret was empty. Guns were there. Ammo was there. But Taylor was gone. Just gone. No blood, no damage, nothing. Like he'd never been there at all. "Same with the tail," Peters added. Jackson's position was empty. His equipment was all there. His logbook was open. But he was just gone. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Around me, the other mechanics had gone very quiet. "How long did this last?" Anderson asked. "Maybe 2 minutes. Then the sphere just shot away. Straight up, faster than anything I've ever seen. And as soon as it left, the instruments came back. The radio started working again. We called for the rest of the crew, but nobody answered from the waist or the tail or the ball turret. 3 men just gone. Military police arrived within 20 minutes. They came in 2 trucks, moving with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. They took Morrison and his crew away for debriefing. They confiscated the bomber's flight logs, the navigator's maps, the radio operator's notes. They cordoned off the damaged fortress with armed guards and wouldn't let any of us near it. I was still there an hour later when I saw something that made my skin crawl. An officer I didn't recognise, wearing an American uniform, but with insignia I'd never seen before, was examining the bomber with what looked like a Geiger counter. He was paying particular attention to the ball turret, to the tailgun position, running his equipment over surfaces and taking readings. He caught me watching and stared at me for a long moment. Then he walked over. "What's your name, son?" "Private First Class Thomas Bennett, sir." "You work on this bird?" "Not this specific one, sir, but I work on B-17s, yes, sir." "You see it come in?" "Yes, sir." "Notice anything unusual about it before it landed?" I hesitated. Something in his eyes told me this was a test, that my answer mattered more than I understood. "Just that it was damaged, sir. Landing gear trouble." He nodded slowly. "Good answer. Keep it that way." The crew experienced combat fatigue. The missing men were blown out during a flak burst over France. "That's the official report. That's what happened. You understand?" "Yes, sir." "I hope you do, Private. For your sake, I really hope you do." He walked away, leaving me standing there in the December cold, watching armed guards surround an empty bomber that had lost 3 men to something that wasn't flak and wasn't combat fatigue. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those empty gun positions, about the sphere pacing the bomber, about Morrison's empty eyes. And I kept thinking about something I'd overheard while the MPs were securing the plane. One of them had said something to another. Just 2 words, but they stuck in my mind like a splinter. Type blue. I didn't know what it meant then, but I would learn. Chapter 3. The Official Silence. The next 3 days were strange. Morrison and his crew remained in isolation, held somewhere in the base's administrative building. The damaged bomber sat under guard on the far side of the field, covered with tarps, untouchable, and everyone who'd witnessed the landing was called in for individual debriefings. My turn came on December 17th. 2 officers, both American, both wearing those same unfamiliar insignia. The room was cold and windowless, just a table and 3 chairs, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. They asked me to describe what I'd seen. I told them about the emergency landing, the damaged gear, the crew emerging. I didn't mention Morrison's story about the sphere or the missing men. That wasn't what I'd seen personally, just what I'd heard. "Did you observe anything unusual about the aircraft's approach?" the older officer asked. He had grey at his temples and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd been asking these questions too many times. "Just that the pilot seemed to have trouble controlling it, sir. No unusual lights, no phenomena in the sky?" "No, sir." "The crew mentioned losing men during the mission. Did you witness any evidence of this?" "I saw 7 men exit the aircraft, sir. I don't know how many were supposed to be aboard." The younger officer leaned forward. "Have you seen any unusual aerial phenomena during your time at Ridgewell? Lights in the sky, unusual aircraft, anything that didn't seem normal?" "I thought about the orange lights, about the figure 8 pattern, about Anderson's warning about psychiatric evaluation." "No, sir, nothing unusual." They exchanged a glance. The older officer closed his notebook. "Private Bennett, what you witnessed was a standard emergency landing following combat damage. 3 crew members were lost due to flak over the target. The pilot and co-pilot experienced spatial disorientation due to instrument failure, which explains any confused reports they may have made upon landing. This is what happened. This is what you will tell anyone who asks. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Because spreading rumours about unusual phenomena during wartime can be considered detrimental to morale. In extreme cases, it can be considered treasonous. The enemy would love nothing more than to have our air crews distracted by ghost stories. And superstition, we can't allow that. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "You're dismissed." I walked out of that room knowing I'd just been threatened, knowing that whatever had really happened to that bomber, the truth was classified at a level that made regular military secrets look like casual conversation, and knowing that I wasn't the first person they'd had this conversation with. Over the next few days, the base settled into an uneasy routine. Morrison's crew was transferred out, sent to different units scattered across England. The damaged bomber was taken away on flatbed trucks under cover of darkness. The armed guards disappeared. It was like the whole incident had been erased, but the pilots kept seeing things. Foo fighters appeared on nearly every mission now, pacing the bomber formations, darting between aircraft, sometimes following individual planes all the way back across the channel. The official policy was to ignore them, to focus on the mission, to not let German tricks distract from the job at hand. Except they weren't German. I knew that with absolute certainty, even if I couldn't prove it. The Germans were good, but they weren't magic, and those lights moved like magic. On the night of December 18th, I was lying in my bunk, unable to sleep, listening to the sounds of the base at night, distant engines, wind rattling the Quonset hut, someone snoring 3 bunks down, and then I heard something that made me sit up. 2 officers walking past outside, their voices carrying in the cold air. Another type blue over Thurley, same pattern as Ridgewell. How many does that make this month? 7 confirmed, God knows how many unreported. London says they're increasing the frequency of phenomena reports. Every base commander from here to Scotland has orders to document and forward immediately. For all the good it does, what are we supposed to do, shoot at them? They move faster than anything we have. The real question is, what do they want? Are they observing? Testing? Hunting? Their voices faded as they moved away, leaving me staring at the dark ceiling of the hut. Type blue. Phenomena reports. 7 confirmed incidents just this month. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than one bomber. bigger than Ridgewell Airfield, bigger than anyone was admitting. I made a decision then. I had to see for myself. I had to know what was really out there, beyond the official stories and the classified debriefings and the threats of psychiatric evaluation. The next time I saw one of those lights, I was going to follow it. I was going to find out what was making them. I had no idea what that decision would cost me. Chapter 4. The Encounter in the Woods. The following night, December 19th, I volunteered for a late shift. Anderson gave me a strange look but didn't question it. Extra hands were always welcome, and I had a reputation as a reliable worker. What I didn't tell him was that I had no intention of staying on the flight line all night. The lights had been appearing most frequently between 2 and 4 in the morning, always over the eastern edge of the base, where the airfield met the forest. At 2:15, I told Jimmy Hartwell I needed to check on some equipment in one of the distant hangars. He barely looked up from the engine cowling he was working on. The December night was bitter cold, the kind that made your lungs ache with each breath. I walked away from the work lights, into the darkness beyond the flight line, heading toward the perimeter fence. The moon was hidden behind clouds, giving me enough darkness to move unseen. The fence was chain link, topped with barbed wire, but there was a section near the forest where maintenance crews had created an unofficial gap for quick access to the woods beyond. Officially, the forest was off limits. Unofficially, everyone knew about the gap, used it for shortcuts, for the occasional illicit hunting trip. I slipped through and found myself among the trees. The darkness was total here, away from the base lights. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust, listening to the winter silence of the woods. Somewhere an owl called, branches creaked in the wind, and underneath it all I felt that same presence I'd felt when watching the orange light execute its impossible maneuvers, the sensation of being observed. I walked deeper into the forest, no clear destination in mind, just following instinct. The ground was frozen hard, covered with a thin layer of frost that crunched beneath my boots. Every sound I made seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. Then I saw it, a glow between the trees ahead, faint at first, like distant firelight, but the colour was wrong for fire, that same orange luminescence I'd seen in the sky. I moved toward it, my heart hammering, every rational part of my mind screaming at me to turn back. The trees opened into a small clearing, maybe 40 feet across, and there, hovering perhaps 3 feet above the frozen ground, was something I still struggle to describe adequately. It was roughly the size of a jeep, but the shape was all wrong. Smooth curves, no visible seams or rivets or welds. The surface looked almost liquid in the way it reflected the orange glow, which seemed to emanate from within rather than from any external light source. The colour pulsed slowly, like breathing. No sound. That's what struck me most forcefully. No engine noise, no hum of generators, no crackle of electricity. Just this absolute silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the hammer of my pulse in my ears. And it was doing something impossible. It was hovering with no visible means of propulsion. No wings, no rotors, no jets of air or flame, just floating there, defying every law of physics I'd been taught. I stood at the edge of the clearing, unable to move, unable to look away. And as I watched, something changed. The glow intensified slightly. The pulse, quickening. The air itself seemed to thicken, become heavier, pressing against my skin. Then something moved behind the object. A figure. Tall, very tall, perhaps 7 feet. Thin. Moving in a way that looked studied, artificial. Like someone who'd learned to walk by watching rather than by instinct. It stepped out from behind the hovering craft, and I saw it clearly in the orange light. Not human. That was immediately, viscerally obvious. The proportions were wrong. The joints bent in ways that suggested a fundamentally different skeletal structure. The head was larger than it should be, the limbs too long and too slender. It wore something, a covering or suit that was the same seamless material as the craft, reflecting the orange light. It turned toward me, and though I couldn't see eyes in any conventional sense, I knew it was looking at me, knew it saw me, knew I'd been expected. My legs went weak. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air had become so heavy it was like being underwater, like the pressure at depth, squeezing me from all sides. The figure raised one long arm, not threatening, just a gesture of acknowledgement. And then something happened that I still can't fully explain. Images flooded my mind. Not pictures exactly, more like concepts given visual form. I saw symbols, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and reconfigure as I tried to focus on them. I saw Earth from high above, as if viewed from orbit, but this wasn't any photograph I'd ever seen. The perspective was wrong, the angle impossible. I saw what looked like star charts, but the constellations were unfamiliar, arranged in patterns I didn't recognize. And underneath it all, I felt something trying to communicate. Not words, nothing so simple as language, but raw meaning being pressed directly into my consciousness. Curiosity. That came through most clearly. Whatever this thing was, wherever it came from, it was curious about us, about me. But there was something else too, buried beneath the curiosity. Something that felt like warning, like urgency, like time running out. The pressure in my head built to an unbearable level. My vision started to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges. I tried to stay conscious, tried to understand what was being shown to me, but the human mind wasn't built for this kind of direct information transfer. The last thing I remember was falling, the frozen ground rushing up to meet me, and the orange glow intensifying to a point where it was no longer light but something else entirely, something that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human perception. Then nothing. Chapter 5. The impossible moment. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. First sensation, cold seeping through my uniform, frost on my face, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth where I'd bitten my tongue. Then sound, wind in the bare branches, the distant rumble of aircraft engines from, the base. Then sight, grey dawn light filtering through the trees above me. I was lying on my back in the clearing. The craft was gone. The figure was gone. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was the complete absence of frost in a perfect circle around where I lay, as if the ground had been warmed by some invisible heat source. I sat up slowly, every muscle aching like I'd been beaten. My watch was on my wrist, but the crystal was cracked and the hands had stopped at 3:17 in the morning. I had no idea what time it actually was now, but the quality of light suggested dawn, which would make it close to 7:30. 4 hours. 4 hours of missing time that existed only as a blank space in my memory. I staggered to my feet, using a tree for support. My head pounded with the worst headache I'd ever experienced, a deep throbbing that seemed to pulse behind my eyes. When I closed them, I saw after images of those geometric symbols, still shifting and reconfiguring, trying to tell me something I couldn't quite grasp. I made my way back through the forest, through the gap in the fence, back toward the flight line. The shift had changed. New mechanics were working on the planes, day crew replacing night crew. I must have looked like hell because the first person who saw me, a sergeant named Collins, immediately grabbed my arm. "Jesus, Bennett, what happened to you? You look like you've been in a fight." I fell in the dark, hit my head. "You need the infirmary, come on." "No, I'm fine, I just need..." "You're not fine, you've got blood on your face, and you can barely stand. That's an order, Private. Infirmary, now." He walked me to the medical station, a small building near the administrative offices. The medic on duty, a corporal named Hayes, sat me down and started checking me over. He cleaned the blood from where I'd bitten my tongue, shone a light in my eyes, checked my pupils. "You might have a concussion," he said. "How long were you unconscious?" "I don't know. A few minutes, maybe." "Your watch is broken. When did that happen?" I looked at the stopped watch, at the hands frozen at 3:17. "When I fell, I guess?" Hayes frowned. "That's weird." "What is?" "Every watch on base stopped last night. Some kind of electromagnetic phenomenon, they said. Happened around 3 in the morning. Lasted maybe 15-20 minutes. Then everything started working again. Except yours, apparently." The room seemed to tilt. "Every watch? Every single one. Also screwed up the radar briefly. The brass is investigating it. But between you and me, I think it's got something to do with those lights people keep seeing. Though officially, I didn't say that." "What time did you say it happened?" "Around 3. Why?" "Because that's when my watch stopped. That's when I was in the clearing, when the pressure in my head became unbearable, when the orange glow intensified to that impossible brightness. Whatever happened to me had affected the entire base." "Bennett, you okay? You're looking pale." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." "I'm going to recommend bed rest for at least 12 hours. No duty until you're cleared. I'll write it up for your CO." I didn't argue. I needed time to think, to process what had happened, to figure out what those symbols meant, and why I could still see them when I closed my eyes. Hayes sent me back to the barracks with orders to rest. I lay on my bunk, listening to the sounds of the base, trying to remember more of what happened in those lost hours. But there was nothing, just that blank space between falling and waking, with only the symbols and images remaining as proof that something had occurred. That afternoon I heard about the radar logs. Officially, they showed a brief equipment malfunction. Unofficially, they showed something else. A blank spot. 17 minutes of missing data, as if every piece of electronic equipment on base had simply stopped working for that exact period of time. 17 minutes. Not 15 or 20 like Hayes thought. Exactly 17 minutes of synchronized temporal disruption. I thought about the documents I would find decades later, about the phrase 17-minute synchronized temporal anomaly, typed on official letterhead. But that was still years away. In that moment, lying on my bunk in December of 1943, all I knew was that something impossible had happened, and the military was already working to explain it away or bury it completely. Chapter 6. Missing Time. The headaches lasted for 3 days, deep throbbing pain that normal aspirin barely touched. Hayes kept me off duty, checking on me twice a day, monitoring my pupils and my responses to basic cognitive tests. He thought it was a concussion. I knew it was something else. The symbols wouldn't leave me alone. When I closed my eyes, they were there, those geometric patterns shifting and reconfiguring. When I tried to sketch them, my hand couldn't quite capture what I saw in my mind. It was like trying to draw a 4-dimensional object using only 2 dimensions. The information was there, but the medium was inadequate. On the 3rd day, Jimmy Hartwell came to see me. He sat on the bunk next to mine, keeping his voice low. "You hear about the investigators?" "What investigators?" "Military intelligence. They showed up yesterday. Different from the regular MPs, different even from those weird officers who came after Morrison's bomber. These guys are from London, maybe higher, and they're asking very specific questions." "About what?" "About the night you went missing, about the electromagnetic event, about anyone who might have been near the perimeter fence around 3 in the morning. He looked at me directly. "You were near the perimeter that night, weren't you?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Tommy, I'm your friend. I'm not going to say anything. But these men, they're not playing games. They've been interrogating people one by one, and the questions they're asking, They know something happened, something specific. What kind of questions? Did you see the object's underside? Did it communicate in images or impressions? Did you experience missing time or temporal displacement? He lowered his voice even further. They're asking if anyone made contact. My mouth went dry. What did you tell them? The truth, that I was working on the flight line all night, that I didn't see anything unusual, except you leaving to check on equipment and not coming back until morning. I covered for you, Tommy. Told them you must have been in one of the distant hangars, that the night shift gets spread out sometimes. But I don't know if they believed me. They're going to want to talk to me. Yeah, probably tomorrow, once Hayes clears you for duty. Whatever happened to you that night, whatever you saw or did, you need to get your story straight. Because these men can make people disappear. I've heard stories. After Jimmy left, I lay there trying to decide what to do. Tell the truth and risk being locked up as insane or worse? Lie and hope they couldn't prove otherwise? The problem was, I didn't fully know what the truth was. I had fragments of memory, images that didn't make sense, and a gap in time I couldn't account for. The investigators came for me the next morning. 2 men in civilian clothes with military posture and cold, evaluating eyes. They took me to the same interrogation room where I'd been debriefed after Morrison's landing, but this time the atmosphere was different, more serious, more dangerous. Private Thomas Bennett, the older one said, consulting a file. Mechanic, good service record, no disciplinary issues. On the night of December 19th, you left your duty station around 0200 hours. Where did you go? There was a report of a hydraulic leak on one of the birds in the far hangar. I went to check it. Anyone see you there? Night shift is pretty empty, that far from the flight line. I was alone. What time did you return? Around 0700, I think. My watch had stopped, so I'm not sure exactly. The younger investigator leaned forward. Your watch stopped at 3:17, the same time every piece of electronic equipment on this base experienced a synchronized malfunction lasting exactly 17 minutes. Do you find that coincidental? I dropped it when I was working. The crystal cracked, it happens. You also presented at the medical station with symptoms consistent with exposure to high levels of electromagnetic radiation. Headaches, disorientation, memory gaps. The medic's report notes you couldn't account for several hours of time. I kept my face neutral. I hit my head. The medic said I might have a concussion. They exchanged a glance. The older one opened a different file, pulled out a photograph. It was grainy, taken at night, with infrared film, but I could make out the forest, the clearing, and something glowing in the centre. The shape was unclear, but the orange luminescence was unmistakable. This photograph was taken by an automatic camera positioned on the perimeter at 0300 hours on December 19th. The camera captured this image, then experienced the same malfunction as everything else on base, 17 minutes of dead time. When it resumed function, the object was gone. He slid the photo across to me. Have you ever seen anything like this? My heart was hammering, but I kept my voice steady. Looks like a light of some kind. Yes, a light that appeared in the forest beyond the perimeter fence at exactly the time you claim to have been in a hangar on the opposite side of the base. A light that coincided with a 17-minute electromagnetic event affecting every piece of equipment we have. He leaned back. I'm going to ask you a direct question, Private Bennett, and I strongly advise you to answer truthfully. Were you in the forest on the night of December 19th? I thought about Jimmy's warning, about people disappearing, about psychiatric evaluations and military prisons. But I also thought about that figure, about the symbols, about the feeling that something important had been communicated to me, even if I couldn't fully understand it yet. No, sir, I was in the hangar. Can anyone corroborate that? No, sir. Like I said, I was alone. The younger investigator stood up abruptly. We know you're lying. We know someone was in that clearing, someone who had close proximity to an unknown object. We have evidence of human presence, footprints, disturbed ground. And you show every symptom of exposure to whatever that thing was. I don't know what to tell you. I wasn't there. The older one closed his files. Let me be very clear about something, Private Bennett. This is a matter of national security. If you had contact with an unknown entity or object, we need to know. We're not going to punish you for it. We're trying to understand what's happening, to determine if these phenomena represent a threat. But we can only do that if witnesses are honest with us. I understand, sir, but I can't tell you about something that didn't happen. They kept at it for another hour, asking the same questions from different angles, trying to catch me in contradictions. But I stuck to my story. I was in the hangar. I hit my head. I don't remember much after that. Eventually, they let me go with a warning that I was to report any unusual sightings or experiences immediately. I walked out of that room, knowing I'd made an enemy of two men who had the power to make my life very difficult. But I also knew with absolute certainty that they'd been telling the truth about one thing. This wasn't the first incident. The photograph, the automatic camera, the specific questions about communication and temporal displacement. They'd been investigating these phenomena for a while. I was just one more data point in a pattern they were trying to understand. That night, I learned something else. Anderson pulled me aside after dinner, his expression grim. Those investigators are ordering a cleanup of the forest area. They're bringing in trucks tomorrow, digging up soil samples, doing a full forensic sweep of the site. He looked at me carefully. Whatever was there, they want to make sure it's completely documented before they sanitize the location. After tomorrow, that whole section of forest is going to be off limits. New fencing, security patrols, the works. Why are you telling me this? Because I saw the medic's report. I saw the investigation file. And I'm not stupid, Tommy. I know you were out there. I know you saw something. He put a hand on my shoulder. Whatever it was, whatever happened to you, keep it to yourself. These people don't play around. I've seen men transferred to Alaska, to remote radar stations, in Greenland, places where they can't talk to anyone about anything. That's if they're lucky. Keep your head down, do your job, and forget whatever you think you saw. What if I can't forget it? Then learn to live with it quietly, because the alternative is much worse. Chapter 7. The Investigation. The trucks arrived at dawn, 3 of them covered with canvas tarps. I watched from the flight line as they drove past the hangars, heading for the eastern perimeter. Military police established a cordon, keeping everyone away from the forest. Whatever they were doing in there, they wanted no witnesses. I went about my work, servicing bombers, replacing worn parts, trying to act like everything was normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about what they were finding in that clearing. Evidence of the craft, evidence of my presence, proof that something impossible had happened there. Around noon, I saw something that made me stop cold. One of the investigators, the younger one who'd interrogated me, was standing near a bomber on the far side of the field. He was holding something, examining it in the winter sunlight. Even from a distance, I could see it glowing faintly orange. They'd found something from the craft, some piece of it left behind. He looked up and caught me staring. For a long moment, we locked eyes across the tarmac. Then he pocketed the object and walked away. The activity in the forest continued for 3 days. Trucks came and went. Men in specialized equipment worked in the cordoned area. New fencing went up, topped with razor wire, with signs warning about live fire training exercises. The message was clear. This area was now forbidden. On the 4th day, the investigators called me in again. Same room, same chairs, But this time there was a third man present. Older than the other two, wearing a uniform I didn't recognise. British, I thought, but the insignia was unlike anything I'd seen before. Private Bennett, the older American investigator, said, "We've completed our examination of the site. I'm going to show you some items, and I want you to tell me if you recognise any of them." He opened a metal case. Inside were several objects sealed in clear bags, soil samples, plant materials, and something else, a small piece of what looked like metal, except it had that same liquid mercury appearance I'd seen on the craft's surface. "Have you seen anything like this before?" He held up the metallic fragment. "No, sir. This material doesn't match anything in our databases. It's not steel, not aluminum, not any known alloy. When we expose it to electromagnetic fields, it exhibits properties that shouldn't be possible. Zero electrical resistance, impossible tensile strength, and it's warm to the touch, despite being stored at room temperature, for 3 days." He set it down and picked up another bag. This one contained what looked like a handful of frost crystals, except they were perfectly geometric, like snowflakes, but with angles that didn't occur in nature. "We found these in a specific pattern around the site. They don't melt, don't sublimate, don't react to heat. They're frozen in a state that our physicists say violates the second law of thermodynamics." He looked at me. "Do you have any explanation for this?" "No, sir." The British officer spoke for the first time. His accent was educated, upper class. "We've been tracking similar phenomena across England for the past 6 months. 7 confirmed incidents, 12 probable incidents, perhaps dozens more that went unreported. Always the same pattern. Electromagnetic disruption, missing time, physical traces that don't match any known technology. The Americans call them Foo Fighters. We call them something else." "What do you call them?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Type blue events, direct contact scenarios, cases where the phenomena appears to have interacted deliberately with human subjects." He leaned forward. "We believe you had such contact, Private Bennett. We believe you were in that clearing. We believe the craft communicated with you in some fashion, and we need to know what it told you." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your medical records show elevated radiation markers. Your psychological screening shows patterns consistent with information overload. You've been sketching geometric symbols in your duty logs." He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a page from my work notes, covered with those shifting patterns I couldn't stop drawing. I stared at the symbols, at the evidence of my own compulsion to record what I'd seen. "What did it show you?" the British officer asked. "What information did it try to impart?" "Nothing, I wasn't there." "We can help you remember. We have specialists, doctors who work with the recovered memories, with trauma-induced amnesia. We can help you understand what happened during those missing 17 minutes. "I don't need help. I wasn't there," the American investigator sighed. "We're trying to protect you, son. If these entities are hostile, if they're gathering intelligence on our military operations, we need to know. If they're selecting specific individuals for contact, we need to understand why. You're not in trouble, but we need your cooperation." I can't cooperate with something that didn't happen. They kept at it for another 2 hours, but I gave them nothing. Eventually they let me go, but the British officer's final words stayed with me. "You'll remember eventually. The human mind can't permanently suppress information of this magnitude. When you do remember, when the nightmares start or the memories surface, you'll want to talk to someone who understands. We'll be waiting." That night, lying in my bunk, I thought about everything they'd said. The type blue designation, the pattern of incidents across England, the suggestion that these entities were selecting specific individuals for contact. Why me? I was nobody, just a mechanic, no special training or knowledge that would make me valuable for intelligence gathering. Unless it wasn't about what I knew. Maybe it was about what I'd seen, or what they wanted me to see. The symbols continued to haunt me. I started seeing them everywhere, in the patterns of frost on windows, in the arrangement of stars on clear nights, in the geometric shadows cast by aircraft wings. My mind was trying to decode something, trying to translate alien concepts into human understanding. And sometimes, late at night when the base was quiet, I felt that presence again. Not visible, not physical, but there, watching, waiting. The war continued. Bombers flew missions over Germany. Men died. The world kept turning. But I carried a secret that grew heavier with each passing day, a truth that no amount of official denial could erase. Something had happened in those woods. Something had made contact. And despite my denials, despite my lies to the investigators, I knew it wasn't finished with me yet. Chapter 8. The Quiet Cover-Up. December became January. The new year arrived with no celebration, just more missions, more maintenance, more cold nights on the flight line. The investigators left, taking their evidence and their questions with them. The cordoned forest remained off limits, but the intense activity stopped. Life at Ridgewell Airfield returned to something resembling normal. Except it wasn't normal. Not for me. The symbols had evolved in my mind, becoming more complex, more insistent. I filled notebooks with them during my off hours, trying to capture the patterns I saw when I closed my eyes. Sometimes, I'd wake in the middle of the night, with my hand cramping from hours of unconscious drawing, pages covered with geometric designs I didn't remember creating. Jimmy noticed. "You okay, Tommy? You're getting kind of obsessive with those drawings." "Just doodling helps me think." "Those aren't doodles, they're..." He studied one of the pages. "They're too perfect, too geometric. What are they supposed to be?" "I don't know. They're just patterns I see sometimes." He looked at me with concern. "Maybe you should talk to the chaplain or something. You've been different since that night you went missing. Quieter, more distant. Whatever happened to you, it's eating at you." "I'm fine." "You're not fine, but I guess that's your business." He handed back the notebook. "Just be careful, okay? Those investigators might be gone, but I guarantee they're still watching. Don't give them a reason to come back." He was right to be worried. I later learned that my mail was being monitored, my movements tracked, my conversations recorded. Not overtly, not in any way I would have noticed at the time, but the surveillance was there. They were waiting for me to crack, to reach out to someone, to reveal what I knew. On January 15th, something happened that changed everything. A bomber returning from a mission over Germany reported contact with FU fighters. But this time, the pilot did something unprecedented. He tried to communicate with them. The report came through channels marked urgent and classified. I only heard about it because Anderson let something slip during a late-night shift. Stupid bastard flashed his landing lights at one of those things. Morse code. Identify yourself. And you know what happened? What? The thing flashed back. Same pattern, same timing, but in reverse, like it was mocking him, or maybe showing it understood. Either way, it scared the crew so badly they nearly ditched in the channel. He shook his head. Command is losing their minds over it. It's one thing for these things to be mysterious. It's another for them to demonstrate intelligence, communication capability. What did the pilot say afterward? That's the weird part. He says he can't remember most of the encounter. Just fragments, images that don't make sense. Sound familiar? It did. It sounded exactly like what had happened to me. That night, I was called to the administrative building. Not to the interrogation room, but to a different office. The British officer was there, the one who'd spoken about Type Blue events. He was alone this time. Sit down, Private Bennett. We need to have a frank conversation. I sat wary. The incident today confirms what we've suspected for months. These entities, whatever they are attempting systematic communication with human subjects. They're studying us, learning our languages, our behaviours, our technology. The question is why? I wouldn't know anything about that, sir. Stop. Just stop with the denials. We both know what happened to you in those woods. I'm not here to interrogate you or threaten you. I'm here because you're part of a very small group of people who've had direct contact with these entities and survived intact enough to potentially remember details. If you know I had contact, why don't you just arrest me? Because that would be counterproductive. We need you cooperative, not terrified. And because arresting you would require explaining to your command structure why, which would mean revealing the existence of a classified research program that most of the military doesn't know exists. He pulled out a folder. I'm going to show you something. Not to prove a point, but because I think you have a right to know you're not alone. He opened the folder. Inside were reports, dozens of them, each marked with those strange insignia I'd seen on the investigators' uniforms, each describing incidents similar to mine. Missing time, electromagnetic disruption, direct contact, communication attempts. Rendlesham Forest 2 years ago, an entire RAF base experienced a Type Blue event. Bentwaters Air Force Base, 3 separate incidents last year. And those are just the documented cases. We estimate there are hundreds more that went unreported because the witnesses were too frightened to come forward. Why are you telling me this? Because the incidents are increasing in frequency. Because we need to understand what these entities want before the situation escalates beyond our control. And because you experienced something during your contact that most others didn't. Successful information transfer. Those symbols you keep drawing, they're not random. They're a language, or the beginning of one. A way of encoding information that transcends conventional human mathematics. He pushed another sheet across to me. It showed one of my symbols, but beneath it was an analysis written in technical language I could barely understand. Something about multi-dimensional geometry and quantum entanglement. You received data, Private Bennett. Your brain is trying to decode it, which is why you can't stop drawing these patterns. The question is, what was the message? I don't know. I can't make sense of any of it. Not yet, but you will eventually. The human mind is remarkably adaptable. Given time, you'll start to understand what you were shown. He closed the folder. When that happens, I need you to contact me. Not your commanding officer, not the MPs, me specifically. He handed me a card with a phone number and nothing else. Why would I do that? Because if you don't, and you start to understand what they showed you, you're going to need help processing it. These entities communicate on a level that human psychology isn't equipped to handle. People who've received significant data transfers often experience breakdowns, psychological fractures, cognitive dissonance that becomes debilitating. I can connect you with resources that can help. Or you just want to study me like a lab rat. Both things can be true. Yes, we want to understand what happened to you, but we also genuinely want to help. These entities chose you for a reason. That makes you valuable, but it also makes you vulnerable. The offer stands. He left me sitting there with the card and too many questions. I threw the card away that night, but I memorized the number first. Some part of me knew I'd need it eventually. January became February. The symbols continued to evolve, and I started noticing other changes, subtle things I couldn't explain. Compasses would spin when I got too close. Electronic equipment would occasionally malfunction in my presence. Once, during a thunderstorm, I watched lightning arc toward me across the open field. only to veer away at the last second, as if deflected by an invisible barrier. I was changing. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever information had been transferred into my mind, it was altering me in ways I couldn't fully understand. The war ended in Europe in May. I was transferred back to the United States in June, honourably discharged in August. I thought leaving England would mean leaving the mystery behind. I was wrong. Chapter 9. The war ends, but the memory doesn't. I returned to Indiana, to the farm I'd grown up on, to a life that should have felt familiar, but didn't anymore. My parents were older, worn by the war years. My younger sister had married while I was overseas. The town had changed in subtle ways, filled with other veterans who moved through their days, with the same haunted look I saw in my own mirror. I tried to readjust to civilian life. Got a job at a garage working on cars instead of bombers. Met a girl named Margaret, who didn't ask too many questions about the war. We married in 47, had 2 children by 50. I should have been happy. I should have moved on. But the symbols wouldn't leave me alone. I dreamed them constantly. Those geometric patterns becoming more elaborate, more complex. Sometimes I'd wake at 3 in the morning, the time forever associated with that night in the woods, and find myself standing in the yard staring at the stars. Margaret learned not to wake me during these episodes, learned not to ask what I was looking for up there. The physical changes intensified. Compasses were useless when I held them. Watches would stop running after a week on my wrist. During thunderstorms, I'd feel static electricity build up around me, my hair standing on end, sparks jumping between my fingers and metal objects. Margaret wanted me to see a doctor. I refused. What would I tell them? That I'd had close contact with something that wasn't human, that I carried information in my head that I couldn't decode, that my body was reacting to something that happened years ago in an English forest? The dreams became more vivid. I started seeing things that weren't in my original memories. The interior of the craft, glimpses of vast distances, star fields viewed from impossible perspectives. Were these actual memories surfacing, or was my mind fabricating details to fill in the gaps? I couldn't tell anymore. In 1953, something happened that proved I wasn't imagining the changes. We were at a church picnic, my family and dozens of others. A summer storm came up suddenly, like they do in Indiana, clouds boiling up from nowhere. Everyone ran for shelter, but I stood there in the rain, watching the lightning. A bolt struck maybe 30 feet away, close enough that I should have felt it. Instead, I felt something else. A pulse of recognition, like the storm was aware of me. And in the after image of the lightning, I saw them again. Those geometric symbols, vast and intricate, written across the sky in electricity. Margaret saw my face. "Thomas, what's wrong? You're white as a sheet. Did you see that? In the lightning?" See what? It was just lightning. But it wasn't. And I knew with sudden terrible certainty that what happened in those woods wasn't finished with me. The contact had been only the beginning. Over the next decade, I learned to live with the strangeness. I avoided electrical equipment when possible. I learned which parts of town had too much electromagnetic interference from power lines and radio stations. I kept a low profile, never drawing attention to myself or the ways I'd changed. But I kept seeing the lights. Not often, maybe once or twice a year, always on storm-heavy nights. Orange glows in the distance, moving with that same impossible speed and precision. They never came close, never made direct contact again, but I knew they were there, watching, checking. In 73, I had a massive heart attack. The doctors said I was lucky to survive. While I was in the hospital recovering, something strange happened. All my symptoms, the electromagnetic sensitivity, The compass disturbances, the lightning attraction. They faded, became less intense. The cardiologist was baffled. My heart should have been damaged, scarred by the attack, but the scans showed tissue regeneration that shouldn't have been possible. He called it a medical miracle. I called it something else. Whatever had been done to me in those woods, whatever changes had been made, they were still active, still working, still trying to, keep me alive, keep me functional. For what purpose? That was when I decided I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand what had really happened, what I'd been carrying all these years. I started researching. This was before the internet, before easy access to information, but I found ways. I wrote to universities, to government agencies, filing Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to World War II aerial phenomena. Most came back denied or heavily redacted, but a few contained hints, fragments of the larger picture. I learned about Project Blue Book, the Air Force's investigation into UFO sightings. I learned about FU fighters being officially dismissed as ball lightning or German experimental weapons. I learned that hundreds of other pilots and crew had reported similar experiences to mine, all of them told to stay quiet, all of them threatened with psychiatric evaluation if they persisted, and in '77 I finally found what I'd been looking for. Chapter 10. The Final Discovery. The documents arrived in a manila envelope marked with British postal stamps. I'd submitted a FOIA request to the Ministry of Defence 2 years earlier, asking for any records related to Ridgewell Airfield and unexplained aerial phenomena in 1943. I'd expected nothing or another denial. Instead, I got 37 pages of declassified documents, most of them heavily redacted, but enough remained to tell me I wasn't crazy, that it had been real. There were incident reports from multiple bases across East Anglia, all describing similar phenomena: orange lights, electromagnetic disruptions, missing time. There were medical reports on air crews who'd had close encounters, noting the same symptoms I'd experienced: elevated radiation markers, psychological changes, compulsive pattern drawing. And there, buried in a memo dated December 21st, 1943, was the phrase that made my hand shake so badly I almost dropped the paper. Recovered foreign aerial mechanism displaying non-conventional propulsion. Analysis suggests non-terrestrial origin. 3 witnesses to recovery operations, all displaying symptoms consistent with direct exposure, including temporal displacement of approximately 17 minutes and evidence of attempted mental projection communication. 17 minutes. The exact duration of my missing time. The exact period during which every watch and piece of electronic equipment on the base had malfunctioned. The memo continued. Physical evidence includes metallic fragments of unknown composition, crystalline structures violating thermodynamic norms, and residual electromagnetic signatures. Witnesses report visual hallucinations of geometric patterns and symbolic language. Recommend immediate transfer of all physical evidence to Section 9 for further analysis. Recommend continued surveillance of witnesses for potential long-term effects. Section 9. I'd never heard of it, but the designation matched what the British officer had told me about classified research programs. Another document, this one from '51, summarised long-term outcomes for individuals who'd had direct contact with Type Blue phenomena. Most had developed various psychological issues, ranging from mild anxiety to complete breakdowns. A few had committed suicide. Several had simply disappeared from public records entirely. But a handful, maybe 10%, had exhibited what the report called adaptive integration. They'd learned to function with the changes, to manage the symptoms, to live relatively normal lives while carrying whatever information had been transferred during contact. I was one of the adapted ones. Somehow, despite everything, I'd managed to survive intact. The final document was different from the others. It was a letter, handwritten, dated 76. It was addressed to all surviving direct contact witnesses and signed by someone whose name was redacted. If you are reading this, you are part of an extremely select group of individuals who experienced direct communication with non-human intelligence during the war years. Many of you have likely spent decades trying to understand what happened, what you were shown, what it meant. I cannot give you complete answers. What I can tell you is this: the contact was deliberate. You were selected, though we do not know the selection criteria. The information transferred to you appears to be a form of mathematical language, encoding concepts that exist outside conventional human understanding. We believe it may be a test of some kind, or perhaps a gift, though the purpose remains unclear. If you are experiencing ongoing effects, physical or psychological, please reach out through the contact information included. We can provide support and, in some cases, explanations, but more importantly, know that you are not alone. Know that what you experienced was real, and know that they are still watching. I sat in my study for a long time after reading that letter, looking at the contact number it provided. It was the same number the British officer had given me back in '44, the one I'd memorised and tried to forget. I never called it. What would be the point? I'd survived, I'd adapted. I had a wife, children, grandchildren. I had a life, even if it was built around a secret I could never fully share. But I kept the documents, filed them away in a box in the attic, along with the notebooks full of symbols I'd drawn over the years. Evidence of a truth that most people would never believe. Margaret passed away in '81. Heart failure, the doctors said. She went peacefully. At the funeral, standing by her grave, I looked up at the grey October sky and wondered what she'd really thought about my strangeness, about the nights I'd stand in the yard staring at the stars, about the compasses that never worked and the watches that kept breaking. She'd never asked directly. Maybe she'd been afraid of the answer. After she was gone, I found myself drawn more and more to the night sky, to watching for those orange lights. I saw them occasionally, always distant, always brief. I'd stand there in the dark behind my house, an old man with a failing heart, and I'd remember that night in the woods. Remember the figure that stepped out from behind the craft. Remember the symbols, burning themselves into my consciousness. And sometimes I'd wonder if the contact had been exactly what that letter suggested. A test, a way of measuring whether humanity was ready for something larger, something beyond our current understanding. If it was a test, I don't know if I passed or failed. I survived, but I never fully understood what they showed me. The symbols remain beautiful, but meaningless. A language I can see but not read. Epilogue. The lights return. I'm writing this in January of '84. I'm 84 years old, the same number as the year, which feels like the kind of coincidence that might not be a coincidence at all. The doctors say my heart is failing. I have months, maybe weeks. My children want me to move in with one of them, to spend my last days surrounded by family. But I can't leave the house, not yet, because they're back. For the past 3 nights, I've seen the orange glow in the tree line behind my property. Not distant anymore, not fleeting, steady, patient, waiting. I know what it means. After 40 years, they're checking to see if I remember. If I kept what they gave me, even though I never fully understood it. And I have. The symbols are still there when I close my eyes, still as clear and intricate as they were that December night in 1943. My children think I'm confused when I talk about the lights. They think it's the medication, or age, or my heart affecting my mind. They don't see them when they visit, which means the lights are only revealing themselves to me. Last night, I stood in the yard for an hour, watching that steady orange glow between the trees. It's closer than it was the night before, moving incrementally, patiently, toward the house. I'm not afraid. That's the strange thing. After decades of carrying this secret, of wondering what it all meant, I feel something like relief. Maybe I'll finally get answers. Maybe I'll finally understand what they showed me. Or maybe I'll just see that figure again, tall and thin, moving with its learned, unnatural walk. Maybe I'll experience that pressure in my head one more time, that sensation of information being transferred directly into my consciousness. Maybe I'll get 17 more minutes of missing time to balance out the first 17 I lost. I've told my son to read this document after I'm gone. I've told him where to find the box in the attic, the one with the declassified files and the notebooks full of symbols. I don't expect him to believe any of it, but I need someone to know. I need this truth to exist beyond my own failing memory. Tonight, I'm going to walk out to the tree line. I'm going to stand where that orange glow emanates from, and I'm going to wait. If my heart gives out, so be it. If something else happens, well, maybe I'll finally understand. Some nights, over the tree line behind my house, I still see an orange glow, and every time, I wonder if they're checking to see whether I remember. I do remember. I've always remembered. And now, finally, I'm ready for whatever comes next. The lights are closer now. It's almost time. Whatever happens, it won't be random. It won't be chance. 40 years ago, in an English forest during the worst war humanity had ever known, something reached out and touched me, changed me, marked me. Now, as an old man facing the end of his natural life, I'm going to meet them again. And this time, maybe I'll be ready to truly understand what they've been trying to tell me all along. The orange glow pulses in the dark. It's beautiful in its way. Not threatening, not hostile, just patient. They've waited 40 years. They can wait another few hours while I finish writing this. To anyone reading this, look up at the night sky sometimes. Pay attention to the lights that move wrong, that accelerate too fast, that seem to watch back when you watch them. They're out there. They've always been out there. And sometimes, for reasons we don't understand, they choose to make contact. I was chosen once. Now I'm being chosen again. I'm going outside now. If you're reading this, it means I didn't come back. But that's okay. After carrying this secret for 4 decades, I'm ready for whatever truth is waiting in those woods. The lights are beautiful tonight. They've been beautiful every night since December 19th, 1943. And now, finally, I'm going to learn what they really mean. Imagine a world before flight, before radar, before radio waves crossed the oceans, a world where the sky belonged only to birds and clouds and the occasional hot air balloon, tethered to the earth by rope and hope. The year was 1897. The Wright brothers were still running a bicycle shop. Powered flight was a fantasy confined to the sketches of dreamers and the pages of Jules Verne novels. And yet, something was flying. Not drifting, flying, with purpose, with control, against the wind. This is not legend. This is not folklore passed down through generations until truth became myth. This is documented history. Tens of thousands of Americans reported seeing massive objects in the sky during the spring of 1897. Newspapers across the Midwest and beyond printed eyewitness accounts. Telegraph operators relayed messages from town to town, each one describing the same impossible thing. They called it the mystery airship. What follows is the account of one man who didn't just see it, he spoke to it. Or rather, it spoke to him. His name was Thomas Kellerman, and in April of 1897, he was a telegraph operator in a small city that no longer appears on most maps. He wrote this account in 1932, 3 years before his death, and it was discovered in a trunk in his daughter's attic in 1978. This is his story. Chapter 1. The night the wires went silent. I had been working the late shift at the Western Union office on Meridian Street for nearly 6 years when it happened. April 14th, 1897. A Tuesday. The kind of night where the air feels heavy even though no rain is coming. The kind of night where dogs pace and horses stamp in their stables for no reason anyone can name. The office was quiet. It usually was after 9 in the evening. Most messages had been sent. Most businesses had closed. I sat at my desk with the telegraph key in front of me, the familiar brass instrument that connected our small city to the rest of the civilized world. In those days, before telephones were common, before radio existed even as a concept, the telegraph was everything. It was how news travelled, how money moved, how the world spoke to itself. I was transcribing a message from Chicago when every line went dead at once, not flickering, not fading, dead. The silence was absolute. In 6 years of operating that key, I had never experienced anything like it. Telegraph lines fail, certainly. Storms knock them down. Animals chew through insulation. Poles fall. But it happens gradually, one line at a time, one city losing connection, while others remain. This was different. Every single line to every city we connected with went silent in the same instant. I checked the connections, I tested the battery, I tapped the key repeatedly, sending out calls that went nowhere, nothing. The lines were physically intact as far as I could tell from inside the office, but they carried nothing. No hum, no static, just dead air. I noted the time, 9:42 in the evening. I sat there in the lamplight, waiting, because there was nothing else to do. The office felt strange in the silence. Normally there was always some background noise, the faint clicking of distant keys, the subtle vibration of signals passing through the wires even when they weren't intended for us. But now there was nothing. It felt like the entire country had stopped breathing. The silence lasted exactly 9 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall, counting every second, wondering if something catastrophic had happened, if somehow the entire telegraph network had been destroyed in some unimaginable disaster. And then at 9:51, every line came back online simultaneously. The key began clicking immediately. Message after message flooded in, all marked urgent, all from different cities within a 100-mile radius. I pulled the tape as it printed, reading the words as they appeared. From Fort Wayne, large object in sky moving south, glowing, silent, not a balloon. From Lafayette, airship sighted over courthouse, impossible size, controlled movement. From Muncie, strange craft overhead, lights along hull, moving against wind, no sound. From Anderson, cigar-shaped vessel in sky, multiple witnesses, telegraph interference reported. They kept coming. Every town, every operator, all reporting the same thing within the same 9-minute window when our lines had been dead. Something was in the sky, something large, something that moved with intention, and something that had interfered with every telegraph line in the region at exactly the same time. I stood up from my desk, my hands shaking slightly as I held the printed tape. The messages were still coming in, variations on the same theme. I walked to the front window of the office and looked out onto Meridian Street. A few people were outside, standing in small groups, pointing upward. I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. That's when I saw it. Chapter 2. The Shape. No one could explain it hung in the sky about 1,000 feet up, maybe less. Distance is hard to judge when you have no reference for the object's size, but it was large, enormously large. Perhaps 200 feet long, shaped like a cigar or a massive elongated egg. The surface appeared dark, almost black, but along the underside ran a series of small lights, maybe 20 or 30 of them, evenly spaced, glowing with a soft yellow-white colour. It moved slowly from north to south, directly over the centre of town. I need you to understand what I'm describing. This was 1897. There were no airplanes. The Zeppelin would not be invented for another 3 years. Balloons existed, certainly, but they were at the mercy of wind, round and clumsy, and incapable of the controlled movement I was witnessing. This object moved deliberately. When the wind blew, from the east the object continued south. When the wind shifted northwest, the object maintained its course. It was not drifting, it was flying, and it was silent. No engine noise, no propeller sound, nothing. Just the faint whisper of wind around its hull, like the sound of a ship cutting through water. But softer, almost gentle. Several people on the street stood frozen, their faces tilted upward, mouths slightly open. I recognised the bank manager, the owner of the general store, a school teacher whose name I forget. Normal people having an abnormal experience. Someone said, "What in God's name is that?" No one answered because no one had an answer. I watched as the object passed directly overhead. The lights on its underside pulsed very slightly, not rhythmically, like a heartbeat, but irregularly, as if responding to some internal process I couldn't understand. The hull itself seemed smooth, almost seamless, without the rivets or panels you would expect on any human-made construction. It looked poured rather than built, organic in a way that metal should not be. A young boy, maybe 12 years old, stood near me on the sidewalk. He asked his father, "Is it from the government?" His father, a blacksmith with hands like hammers, shook his head slowly. "Government doesn't have anything like that, son. Nobody does." The object was moving toward the southern edge of town now, descending slightly as it went. I could see it more clearly as it lowered. There were features I hadn't noticed before, what looked like small protrusions along the sides, perhaps observation ports or windows, though they emitted no light. A subtle taper at the front, like the bow of a ship designed to cut through air instead of water, and at the rear, a series of thin structures that might have been fins or stabilizers. It passed over the last row of buildings and continued toward the open farmland beyond. As it moved, I realized it was heading directly toward the railroad yard, a flat open area where freight cars sat waiting for morning. I made a decision in that moment that would change everything. I went back inside the office, grabbed my coat and hat, and locked the door behind me. Then I followed the airship. Chapter 3. The City Watches. By the time I reached the edge of town, at least 50 people had gathered. Word spreads fast in a small city, especially when something impossible appears in the sky. The crowd stood at the boundary between the last street and the open land, watching as the airship descended slowly toward the rail yard about half a mile distant. The local newspaper editor, a man named Robert Marsh, was there with a notebook, scribbling frantically by the light of a handheld lantern. He looked at me as I approached. "Kellerman," he said, "your telegraph's still working." "It's working now," I replied. "Went dead for 9 minutes right before this thing appeared. Every line in the region reported the same." He wrote that down, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. "Multiple towns reporting sightings. I already confirmed at least 8 within 50 miles, all describing the same object. This is going to be front page across the country." A woman in the crowd, elderly and sharp-eyed, said loudly, "It's a sign, end times. The Bible speaks of vessels descending from heaven." A younger man countered, "It's Edison or Tesla. Has to be. Some kind of electric airship they've been testing in secret." Someone else, "Could be European. Germans have been working on dirigibles." But we all knew those explanations didn't fit. This thing moved too smoothly, too quietly, with too much control. And the timing, the simultaneous telegraph interference, the coordinated sightings across multiple cities, none of it aligned with any human technology we knew. The airship had stopped descending and now hovered about 30 feet above the rail yard. The lights along its underside grew slightly brighter, casting pale circles of illumination on the ground below. The crowd grew quieter, sensing something was about to happen. I felt it too, a pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Then the lights on the airship began to pulse in a pattern, not random, deliberate, a sequence, long pulses and short pulses with precise intervals between them. I recognized the rhythm immediately. It was Morse code, or something very close to it. I pulled a small notebook from my pocket, the one I always carried for recording messages, and began writing down the sequence. Long, short, short, long, long, short, short, long, long. It repeated 3 times, then stopped. I stared at the pattern, trying to decode it, but it didn't match any standard Morse sequences I knew. The intervals were wrong. The groupings were unfamiliar. Robert Marsh leaned over my shoulder. "What does it say?" "I don't know," I admitted. "It's structured like code, but it's not any code I recognize." The airship began moving again, drifting slowly eastward, away from the town and the crowd. Some people started to follow, walking across the open field, but most remained where they were, uncertain and afraid. I stood there with my notebook, watching the lights fade into the distance, and felt a strange certainty settle over me. This wasn't observation. This was communication, and it was directed at me. Chapter 4. The Interference. I returned to the telegraph office just after midnight. The streets were still busy with people discussing what they had seen. Groups gathered under street lamps, voices excited and nervous. I unlocked the door and went inside, lighting the lamp on my desk. The office felt different now, charged somehow, as if the air itself had been altered by what had happened. The telegraph key sat silent on the desk. I sat down in my chair and stared at it, thinking about the pattern of lights I had seen on the airship, the way they pulsed in structured sequences. I opened my notebook and looked at what I had written. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. Then the key began clicking on its own. My hand was nowhere near it. The key depressed and released, tapping out a rhythm that made the brass lever bounce and the sounder clack. I watched, frozen, as the tape began feeding through the register, recording whatever signal was coming through the wire. But there was no signal. I could see that the line indicator showed no activity. The battery was disconnected. The key should not have been moving at all. It clicked for perhaps 30 seconds, printing a line of marks on the tape that made no sense in Morse code. Then it stopped. The office fell silent again. I pulled the tape free and held it up to the lamplight, studying the pattern. It was similar to what I had seen on the airship, but more complex, more detailed. There were subtle variations in the spacing, slight differences in the length of the marks that suggested layers of meaning I couldn't access. I set the tape down on the desk and looked out the window. The airship was no longer visible in the sky, but I had the unmistakable feeling that it was still close, still watching. The pressure in my head returned. That same sensation I had felt when the lights had pulsed in the rail yard. Not painful, but present, like someone standing just behind you in an empty room. I reached out and placed my fingers on the telegraph key. I began tapping out a simple message in standard Morse code. "Who are you?" The moment I finished, the key stopped vibrating under my hand. The pressure in my head intensified briefly, then vanished. I sat there in the silence, waiting for a response, but nothing came. I tried again. "What do you want?" Still nothing. Then I realized my mistake. I was using human language, human symbols. Whatever was on the other end of this communication understood structure and pattern, but not necessarily our specific codes. I needed to respond in the same way it had contacted me. I looked at the sequence on the tape, the pattern it had sent. I began tapping it back on the key, reproducing the rhythm as accurately as I could. Long, short, short. Long, long, short. Short, long, long. I repeated it 3 times, exactly as the airship's lights had done. The key went still under my fingers. And outside, barely visible through the window, the airship descended from the clouds directly above Meridian Street. It hung there, motionless, the lights on its underside glowing bright enough now to cast shadows on the street below. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and walked to the door. I opened it and stepped outside. The airship lowered until it hovered just above the roof line of the buildings. I could see details now that had been invisible from a distance. The hull was not metal, or if it was metal, it was unlike any I had ever seen. It had a faint iridescence, like oil on water, shifting subtly in colour as the light moved across it. The small protrusions I had noticed earlier were definitely ports of some kind, circular openings rimmed with a darker material. And then, with no sound at all, the airship began to move again. It drifted southward, slowly, deliberately, and I understood that it wanted me to follow. I grabbed my coat and hat from inside the office, locked the door, and began walking. Several people on the street watched me go, watched the airship drifting ahead of me, but no one else followed. Perhaps they were too afraid, perhaps they were smarter than I was. I followed the airship out of town, toward the rail yard, toward whatever waited there. Chapter 5. The Descent. The rail yard was deserted at that hour. Freight cars sat in silent rows, their shadows long under the moonlight. The airship descended slowly into the centre of the open area, its lights illuminating the dirt and gravel below. I approached carefully, staying about 100 feet back, watching as the massive object lowered itself to the ground with impossible gentleness. It touched down without impact, settling onto the earth as lightly as a feather. The lights along the underside dimmed slightly, but did not go out. I could hear it now, a very faint humming, so low it was almost below the threshold of hearing. Not mechanical, more like a vibration, a frequency felt as much as heard. 2 other men had followed me from town, though I hadn't noticed them until now. One was Robert Marsh, the newspaper editor, still clutching his notebook. The other was a farmer named William Hayes, a practical man not given to flights of fancy. We stood together at the edge of the rail yard. 3 witnesses to something none of us could explain. The airship sat there for perhaps 5 minutes, humming softly, its lights pulsing in that strange irregular rhythm. Then, with a sound like air escaping from a sealed container, a section of the hull opened. Not a door swinging on hinges. The surface simply separated, creating an opening about 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. No light came from inside, only darkness, and then a figure stepped out. Chapter 6. The Occupant. It was humanoid. That was the first thing I noticed. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a torso, proportioned similarly to a human being, but not quite right. Too tall, perhaps 7 feet. Too thin, the limbs longer than they should be. It wore some kind of tight-fitting garment that covered everything except the head and hands. A material that looked almost liquid in the moonlight, dark blue or black, seamless. The head was the most unsettling feature. Pale, hairless, with large eyes that caught the light and reflected it back with a faint golden sheen. The nose was small, almost vestigial. The mouth was a thin line, barely visible. The overall impression was not monstrous exactly, but profoundly other. This was not a human being in a costume. This was something else. It stood at the opening of the airship, motionless, and turned its head slowly to look at each of us in turn. When its eyes met mine, I felt that pressure in my head again. Stronger now, almost overwhelming. Not painful, but intrusive, as if something was pushing gently against the inside of my skull. I tried to step back but found I couldn't move. My feet seemed rooted to the ground. The figure stepped forward, moving with a strange gliding motion that made it hard to tell if it was walking or floating. It approached us slowly, stopping about 20 feet away. Robert Marsh made a small choking sound and dropped his notebook. William Hayes stood rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I remained still, unable to move, locked in place by whatever force was emanating from this being. And then it spoke. Or rather, it communicated. There was no sound, no words, but meaning flooded into my mind with absolute clarity. Not language, concepts, images, understanding delivered directly, bypassing the need for translation. I saw maps, not maps of land, but maps of connection. Lines crisscrossing continents, nodes where the lines intersected, pulses of light moving along the paths. I saw cities connected by invisible threads, messages flowing between them at the speed of lightning. I saw the telegraph network, not as wires and poles and keys, but as humanity's first attempt at creating a nervous system, a way for the species to communicate across distance instantly. And I understood that this was what interested them. Not our cities, not our wars, not our religions or governments or art, our communication networks. The moment when we stopped being isolated communities and started becoming something connected, something that could speak to itself across vast distances. The pressure in my head increased and more images came. I saw the airship, not as a single vessel, but as one of many, positioned across the continent, observing, recording. I saw them hovering over telegraph stations, following the lines, mapping the network. They were studying the infrastructure of human communication, the way a naturalist might study the veins in a leaf. And then I saw something else, a flash of the future, though I didn't understand it at the time. I saw towers transmitting invisible waves through the air. I saw voices carried without wires. I saw light pulsing in patterns that conveyed thought and image and sound simultaneously. I saw the world covered in a web of signals so dense that no point on Earth was isolated. Everything connected, everything speaking. They were interested in the beginning of that process, the moment we became detectable. The figure tilted its head slightly, and I felt a question forming in my mind. Not words, but the sense of inquiry. It wanted to know if I understood. I tried to form a response, to think clearly and deliberately. Yes, I understand. The pressure released immediately. The figure stepped back, its large eyes still fixed on me, and then turned smoothly and walked back to the airship. It paused at the opening, looked back once more, and then disappeared inside. The hull sealed itself with that same soft hissing sound. I could move again. I staggered slightly, catching my balance, and looked at Robert and William. They both appeared shaken, pale in the moonlight. Robert picked up his notebook with trembling hands. "Did you?" he started, then stopped. "Did you see?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I saw." The airship began to rise. Chapter 7. The Message. It lifted slowly, without sound, without fire or steam, or any visible means of propulsion. The lights along the underside grew brighter as it ascended, casting long shadows across the rail yard. We watched it climb until it was several hundred feet up, then turn smoothly and begin moving northward, back toward the centre of town. I ran, I don't know why. Instinct, perhaps, the sense that something important was about to happen, and I needed to be at the telegraph office when it did. Robert and William followed, the three of us running through the dark streets as the airship drifted overhead. By the time we reached Meridian Street, people were emerging from their homes again, pointing at the sky, calling to each other. I unlocked the office and rushed inside, Robert and William close behind. I lit the lamp and sat down at the telegraph desk just as the key began clicking again. This time it was different. This time it was deliberate, controlled, sending a specific pattern. The tape fed through the register, recording the marks as they appeared. The sequence was complex, far more intricate than anything I had seen before. It went on for nearly 2 minutes, the key clicking steadily, the tape spooling out onto the desk, and then it stopped. The airship, visible through the window, rose straight up at tremendous speed and vanished into the clouds in seconds. The lights faded. The humming ceased. It was gone. I pulled the tape free and spread it out on the desk. Robert leaned over my shoulder, his breath still coming in short gasps from the run. William stood by the window, watching the empty sky. I studied the pattern, trying to make sense of it, but it was beyond my understanding. The sequences were too complex, the variations too subtle. It looked almost mathematical, like some kind of formula or equation rendered in dots and dashes. "What does it mean?" Robert asked. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think it's important." I folded the tape carefully and put it in my pocket. The three of us sat there in silence for a long time, processing what we had witnessed. Eventually, Robert spoke. "I have to write this story. People need to know." "They won't believe you," William said quietly. "They'll say you're mad." "Maybe," Robert replied, "but I still have to try." He left shortly after, and William followed. I remained in the office, sitting at the desk, thinking about the maps I'd seen, the networks of light, the future, that had been shown to me. I thought about the being that had communicated with me, the way it had looked at me with those large golden eyes, and I wondered what it had seen when it looked back. The telegraph lines remained quiet for the rest of the night. No more strange signals, no more interference, just the normal flow of messages between cities, the routine communication that kept the country connected. But I knew that nothing was routine anymore. Something had noticed us. Something had come to observe the moment when humanity learned to speak across distance, and they had left me a message I couldn't understand. Not yet. Chapter 8. The Departure. The next morning the story spread like wildfire. Robert Marsh published his account in the newspaper, describing the airship in detail, naming me and William as witnesses. Other papers picked up the story. Within days, it was being reported across the country. Thousands of people came forward with their own sightings, describing similar objects in skies from Texas to Michigan, from California to New York. But the narrative began to change almost immediately. Editors started adding qualifying language. Alleged airship, reported sighting, mass hysteria. Scientists weighed in, offering explanations. Venus seen through atmospheric distortion, ball lightning, experimental balloons from secret government projects. The explanations multiplied, each one more confident than the last, each one ignoring the specific details that made the sightings impossible to dismiss. Robert Marsh came under significant pressure. His editor at the paper demanded he retract the story, calling it irresponsible journalism. Local officials questioned him, suggesting he had fabricated the account for attention. Within 2 weeks, a follow-up article appeared in the paper, written by Robert but clearly edited heavily, stating that upon further reflection, he believed the object had been a misidentified balloon and that the late hour and unusual circumstances had led to mistaken observations. He came to see me at the Telegraph office the night that article was published. He looked exhausted, defeated. "I'm sorry," he said. "They didn't give me a choice. It was retract or lose my position." "I understand," I told him. "Did I do the right thing?" he asked. "Should I have fought harder?" I thought about the being I had seen, the message I had received, the future I had glimpsed. "You did what you had to do to survive," I said. "That's all any of us can do." He nodded slowly and left. I never spoke to him about it again. William Hayes stopped coming into town, retreating to his farm, refusing to discuss what he had seen. I was questioned by government officials, men in dark suits who arrived from Washington and asked the same questions over and over, their faces impassive, their voices flat. They wanted to know what I had seen, what had been communicated, whether I had the telegraph tape. I told them everything except that last part. I described the airship, the being, the images in my mind. But I said nothing about the final message, the pattern that had been sent to my telegraph key. That tape remained in my pocket and later hidden in a metal box in my home. The officials eventually left, seemingly satisfied that I had nothing useful to offer. The sightings continued for another month, then gradually stopped. By summer, the airship wave had faded from public consciousness, dismissed as a curious episode of mass delusion. Life returned to normal. The telegraph lines carried their routine messages. The country moved forward, unaware that it had been observed at a crucial moment in its development. But I knew, and I kept the tape, waiting for the day when I might understand what it meant. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Years passed, the 20th century arrived. The Wright brothers achieved powered flight in 1903, and suddenly the skies that had been impossible for humans to navigate became accessible. Airplanes multiplied. The impossible became commonplace, but the airship of 1897 was forgotten, relegated to the dustbin of historical oddities, a footnote in the story of American credulity. I continued working as a telegraph operator until 1918, when I retired. I married, had children, lived a quiet life, but I never forgot that night in April of 1897. I kept the tape hidden, taking it out occasionally to study it, hoping that new developments in communication technology might give me a framework for understanding the pattern. In 1920, when commercial radio broadcasts began, I felt a shock of recognition. The frequencies, the way signals were transmitted through the air, without wires, the patterns of electromagnetic waves, they echoed something I had seen in the images the being had shown me. The future I had glimpsed was beginning to arrive. I took out the tape and studied it again, this time with knowledge of radio technology. And slowly, over the course of months, a pattern began to emerge. The sequences on the tape corresponded to frequency intervals. Not exact matches, but close enough that the correlation couldn't be accidental. The message was a map of the electromagnetic spectrum, highlighting specific ranges that would become useful for human communication. They'd given me a guide to radio frequencies before we had discovered radio. I sat at my kitchen table, the tape spread out in front of me, and understood fully for the first time what had happened. The airship had not been exploring our world. It had been monitoring our technological development, waiting for the moment when we created infrastructure for long-distance communication. The telegraph network had been the trigger, the sign that humanity was transitioning from isolated communities to a connected civilization. And they had come to observe that transition, to record it, perhaps to encourage it by leaving behind information we would eventually be able to understand. They were tracking the moment we became detectable across interstellar distances, the moment our signals began radiating out into space. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. We had been noticed, we had been deemed worthy of observation, perhaps even assistance, but we had also revealed ourselves, broadcasting our presence to anyone or anything capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation. We had become visible. Chapter 10. Understanding Too Late. I am writing this account in 1932. I am 78 years old. My hands shake when I hold a pen, and my eyesight is failing. But I feel compelled to record what I experienced, what I understood, even if no one believes it. The world has changed dramatically since 1897. Radio is everywhere. Telephones connect continents. Television is beginning to emerge. The network of communication that I glimpsed in those images, shown to me by the being from the airship, has become reality. We are connected now in ways that would have seemed magical to someone from my youth, and we are broadcasting constantly. Radio waves carrying music and news and voices radiate out from our planet in every direction, travelling at the speed of light, reaching farther into space with every passing year. We have become a beacon, announcing our presence to any civilization capable of detecting it. I look at the tape sometimes, the message sent to me that night in the rail yard. I understand it now, mostly. It was a primer, a basic guide to the frequencies we would need for effective communication. It was meant to help us, or perhaps to accelerate our development. I don't know if the being expected me to share this information, or if it simply assumed that we would discover these things on our own, and the message was merely confirmation. I never shared it. Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps I should have given the tape to scientists, let them study it, let them use the information to advance our technology faster. But I was afraid of being labelled insane, afraid of the attention it would bring, afraid of what it might mean if the information was taken seriously. So I kept silent, and the world developed radio on its own, following the natural progression of scientific discovery. Maybe that was how it was supposed to happen. Maybe my role was simply to witness, to understand, to record. I have thought often about the being I met, the way it looked at me with those large golden eyes. I have wondered what it saw when it examined me. Did it see an intelligent creature, worthy of contact? Or did it see a primitive organism, barely beginning to understand the universe it inhabited? Did our brief communication mean anything to it? Or was I simply a data point, one among thousands, recorded and filed away? I have also thought about why they came when they did. The telegraph was not the first human technology. We had been building and creating for thousands of years, but the telegraph was different. It was the first technology that allowed instant communication across vast distances, the first that created a network, a web of connection that covered the continent. It was the moment when we stopped being isolated and started being unified. That was what interested them. Not our tools or our weapons or our buildings. Our ability to communicate. Our transition from scattered tribes to a connected civilization. They were observing a threshold being crossed, a moment of transformation. And now, as I write this in 1932, I wonder if they are still watching. Radio has existed for over a decade. Our signals are spreading through space, reaching farther every day. Have they detected those signals? Are they observing our continued development? Will they return? I don't know, but I suspect they don't need to return. They came at the crucial moment, the beginning. They recorded what they needed to record, and now they are waiting, watching from a distance, as we continue to evolve, as we continue to build our networks, as we continue to broadcast our presence to the universe. We think we are alone. We think the vast silence of space confirms our isolation. But I know differently. I have seen proof that we are observed. I have met a being from beyond our world, communicated with it, received information from it. We are not alone. We have never been alone. We just didn't know how to see until we learned how to speak across distance. Epilogue. The quiet warning. I will die soon. I can feel it in my bones, in the increasing fragility of my body. My daughter will inherit my belongings, including the metal box with the telegraph tape inside. I have left instructions that it should be preserved, though I doubt she will understand why. Perhaps someday, someone will find it and recognize its significance. Perhaps not. But I want to leave this final thought, this last observation that has haunted me for 35 years. The airship did not arrive when we learned to fly. It did not arrive when we built cities or created art or developed philosophy. It did not arrive when we discovered fire or invented the wheel or domesticated animals. It arrived when we learned to speak across distance, when we created networks that connected us invisibly, instantaneously, when our signals began to propagate beyond our immediate surroundings. That was the threshold. That was the moment that mattered. And if that is the case, if the ability to communicate across distance is what marks a civilization as significant, as detectable, as worthy of observation, then what happens when our communication networks expand beyond our planet? What happens when our signals reach the stars? What happens when we are not just connected to each other, but potentially connected to others? I think about this often as I sit in my chair, looking out the window at the night sky. Somewhere up there, beyond the stars I can see, are others, civilizations that learned to speak across distance long before we did, civilizations that have been broadcasting their presence for centuries or millennia, civilizations that are connected in ways we cannot yet imagine. And they are listening. They arrived when we learned to speak across distance. They observed us at that crucial moment. They left a message for us to find when we were ready. The question is not whether they will return. The question is what they heard when they listened, and whether we are ready for what comes next. This is the account of Thomas Kellerman, telegraph operator, written in the autumn of 1932. The metal box containing the telegraph tape was discovered in 1978 among his daughter's possessions. The tape remains in a private collection. Its authenticity has never been verified, and the pattern recorded on it has never been fully decoded. But radio continues to broadcast, and somewhere, perhaps, someone is still listening. End. There are sounds that shouldn't exist, frequencies that carry voices from places they should never originate. In 1994, in a monitoring station outside Denver, Colorado, a broadcast engineer named Marcus Webb heard something that would change everything he understood about what watches us from above. This is his account. This is the last transmission. Intro. The signal that shouldn't exist. The graveyard shift at Sentinel Communications was supposed to be boring. That was the entire point. Marcus Webb had been monitoring dead satellite channels for 3 years, and in all that time, the most exciting event had been a brief solar flare that caused static interference across 6 frequencies simultaneously. Most nights, he sat in the dimly lit control room, surrounded by banks of equipment that hummed with the white noise of empty space, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago and waiting for nothing to happen. The job existed because regulations required it. Someone had to monitor the channels, even the ones that had been dark for decades. Decommissioned satellites, abandoned frequencies, the technological graveyard of the early space age. Marcus was that someone, working from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, alone except for the building's security guard who made rounds every 2 hours. It was a Tuesday in March when everything changed. 2:47 in the morning, according to the timestamp that would later be examined by people Marcus would never meet. He was reading a paperback thriller, barely paying attention to the monitors, when Channel 73 suddenly activated. Not with static, not with the carrier wave hiss that usually preceded a legitimate transmission. The channel simply came alive, as if someone had flipped a switch, and a voice began speaking. Clear, calm, professional. This is station Helix 9, transmitting weather monitoring data on frequency band 73.2. Current atmospheric conditions as follows. Marcus dropped his book. Channel 73 hadn't carried a signal in over 20 years. He knew this because he'd reviewed the archive logs during his first week on the job. Helix 9 was a weather monitoring station that had been decommissioned in 1976, its equipment stripped and sold for parts. The frequency had been reallocated, then abandoned, then forgotten, but someone was using it now. The voice was male, middle-aged, with the practiced cadence of someone reading technical data. It rattled off barometric pressures, wind speeds, temperature gradients. Everything sounded routine, professional, completely normal, except it was coming from a channel that should have been silent. Marcus's training kicked in. He began logging the transmission, noting the timestamp, the frequency, the signal strength, strong, incredibly strong, stronger than it should have been for a ground-based transmitter. He checked the directional antenna data, trying to triangulate the source. The readings made no sense. The signal wasn't coming from any ground station. The angle of reception, the signal propagation pattern, everything indicated an orbital source, but that was impossible. Helix 9 had been a ground-based installation in northern Montana. Its satellite relay had been deorbited in 1978. Marcus picked up the direct line to regional operations, then hesitated. What would he say? That a dead station was broadcasting? That he was receiving a signal from nowhere? They'd think he'd fallen asleep. That he was dreaming or malfunctioning equipment was creating phantom signals. He put the phone down and kept listening. Chapter 1. A familiar stranger. The voice continued through the night, never pausing, never breaking character. It provided weather data with meticulous precision, using terminology and formatting protocols that Marcus recognized from vintage training manuals. This wasn't someone playing a prank. Whoever was transmitting knew exactly how weather monitoring stations operated in the mid-70s. By 4 a.m, Marcus had filled 6 pages of notes. Signal strength consistent. No variation in voice characteristics. Transmission pattern matched historical Helix 9 protocols exactly. He'd pulled up archived recordings from the actual station, samples preserved in the Sentinel Communications database, and compared them to what he was hearing now. Different voice, same everything else. At 4:23, the transmission changed slightly. The voice finished a routine weather report, then added something that made Marcus sit up straight in his chair. Additional notation. Observational data indicates pressure system developing over northeastern Colorado. Anticipate localized electrical anomalies within the next 18 minutes. Marcus glanced at the weather monitor mounted on the wall. Clear skies over Denver. No storm systems within 200 miles. He made a note of the prediction and went back to logging. 17 minutes later, the lights in the control room flickered. The backup power system kicked in for a fraction of a second before main power restored itself. The building's environmental controls hummed as they reset. Marcus stared at his watch, then at his notes. 18 minutes, almost exactly. He reached for the phone again. This time he dialed through to the National Weather Service Regional Center. A tired-sounding meteorologist named Phillips answered on the 4th ring. "This is Marcus Webb at Sentinel Communications. Did you just register any electrical activity over the Denver metro area?" "Funny you should ask," Phillips replied. "We just got a weird reading. Brief electromagnetic pulse, very localized, no apparent source, probably equipment malfunction on our end." "Why?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "We picked up something on our monitors. Just wanted to confirm." "Everything okay out there?" "Yeah, just checking, thanks." He hung up and looked back at his notes. The voice on channel 73 had predicted something that conventional weather monitoring hadn't detected. Something that happened exactly when the transmission said it would. At 5:11, it happened again. Observational data indicates satellite transponder failure on telemetric 7 within the next 4 minutes. Recommend signal rerouting protocols. Marcus didn't have access to telemetric 7's operational data, but he knew people who did. He sent a quick email to a contact at the Satellite Operations Center, asking if they'd seen anything unusual. The response came back 9 minutes later. "Lost signal from T7 at 0515. Transponder fault. How did you know?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't, because he didn't know how he knew. He only knew that a voice from a station that didn't exist was telling him things that were about to happen, and so far it had been correct every single time. The sun was starting to rise when the voice said something that changed everything. "Marcus Webb, monitoring station designation Sentinel 417. This transmission is intended for you specifically." Marcus felt his heart stop. The voice knew his name, his station designation. It was talking to him. "Do not be alarmed. This is not a threat. This is an observation. You are listening because you are meant to listen. The frequency opened because you were present to receive it." Marcus's mouth was dry. He tried to speak, to respond, but the transmission was one way. He could receive, but not send. Not on this equipment. The voice continued, still calm, still professional. You were 7 years old when you saw the light in the sky above your grandfather's farm. August 1973. You told no one because you believed no one would believe you. You remember the way it moved, silent, purposeful. Gone before you could call for your grandfather. Marcus stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. His hands were shaking. That memory was real. He'd buried it for years, convinced himself it had been a plane or a satellite or his imagination. He'd never told anyone, not his parents, not his wife, no one. The voice knew. This transmission will continue. You will listen. That is all that is required. Then it went back to reading weather data as if nothing had happened. Chapter 2. The signal knows things. Marcus didn't go home when his shift ended. He stayed in the control room, listening, logging, trying to make sense of what was happening. The day shift operator, a woman named Jennifer Kowalski, found him at 7:30, still sitting at his station, surrounded by notes. You look like hell, she said. Long night. You could say that, Marcus gestured to channel 73. Have you ever picked up anything on this frequency? Jennifer glanced at the monitor. That's been dead since before I started here. Why? Just checking. He didn't tell her about the transmission, didn't mention the voice. He gathered his notes, logged out, and drove home in a daze. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table, reviewing everything he'd recorded. The predictions, the impossible knowledge, the reference to his childhood. None of it made sense according to any framework he understood, but it was all documented, time-stamped, verified. He returned to work that night at his regular time. Channel 73 was silent when he arrived. He sat down, started his routine checks, tried to convince himself that the previous night had been some kind of equipment malfunction, a psychological episode brought on by too many graveyard shifts and not enough sunlight. At 11:41, the voice returned. Station Helix 9 resuming transmission. Current observational data as follows. Marcus grabbed his notebook and started writing. The voice provided another series of weather predictions, localized phenomena, electrical disturbances, equipment failures, all of them minor, all of them specific, all of them accurate. At 2:15 in the morning, the voice addressed him again. Marcus Webb, you have questions. This is understood. Clarification will be provided in stages. First stage, this transmission originates from orbital position. Second stage, this transmission has been monitoring Earth for an extended period. Third stage, you are not the first to listen. Marcus found his voice. Even though he couldn't transmit, he spoke out loud in the empty control room. Who are you? What do you want? The voice didn't respond to his questions. It simply continued. Fourth stage, this communication is not hostile. Fifth stage, your willingness to listen has been noted. Sixth stage, more will be revealed as tolerance for information increases. Then back to weather data, barometric pressures, wind patterns, temperature inversions. Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Orbital position, monitoring Earth. Not the first to listen. The implications were staggering, but the voice presented them with the same calm professionalism it used to describe cloud formations. Over the next week, the pattern continued. Every night, the transmission would begin within an hour of Marcus starting his shift. It would provide weather data, predict minor events with unsettling accuracy, and occasionally insert statements clearly directed at him. Never threatening, never demanding, just observing, explaining, revealing. Marcus started researching. He pulled every file he could access about Helix 9, about decommissioned satellites, about unexplained signals. He He found references to other monitoring stations that had reported anomalous transmissions over the years. Most had been dismissed as interference or equipment malfunction. A few had resulted in disciplinary action for the operators who reported them. He found one incident report from 1981. A communications technician in Alaska had logged a signal from a decommissioned relay station, claiming it was providing advance warning of solar flare activity. The technician had been transferred to a different position after a psychiatric evaluation. The signal had never been officially verified. Marcus kept his mouth shut and kept listening. Chapter 3: The Shape in Orbit. On the 8th night, Marcus decided to do something he'd been avoiding. He was going to triangulate the exact source of the transmission. Sentinel Communications had access to orbital tracking data through their satellite operations division. If the signal was truly coming from orbit, he could find it. The equipment required some creative requisition. Marcus told the operations manager he was running signal integrity tests, which wasn't entirely a lie. He set up a secondary receiving array, calibrated the directional antennas, and waited for the transmission to begin. When the voice started speaking at 11:37, Marcus began logging positional data, signal angle, propagation delay, frequency shift. The physics of radio waves didn't lie. If something was transmitting from space, these measurements would reveal it. The calculations took 3 hours. Marcus ran them twice to be sure. Then he sat staring at the results, feeling a cold understanding settle into his bones. The signal was originating from an object in a circular orbit, approximately 400 miles above Earth's surface. The orbit was stable, non-decaying, and had been maintained for an unknown period. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The object wasn't in any orbital database. No launch record, no registration, no tracking identification. As far as official records were concerned, nothing existed at those coordinates. But something was there. Something that maintained a perfect orbit without propulsion corrections. Something that had been silently circling the planet, watching for God only knew how long. Marcus pulled up the current satellite tracking display. Hundreds of objects filled the screen. Active satellites, dead satellites, debris. He entered the coordinates of the mystery object. The screen showed empty space. According to every official source, nothing was there. Marcus overlaid historical orbital data going back to the beginning of the space age. He expected the object to appear at some point, to have a launch date, a point of origin. Instead, he found something that made no sense. Fragmentary data, brief references in declassified military reports from the 60s, an unidentified orbital object that appeared intermittently on tracking systems, then disappeared. Always in roughly the same orbit, always maintaining position. The report stopped in 1973, not because the object left, but because someone had decided to stop reporting it. Marcus searched for any reference to Helix 9 in those old reports. He found one document, heavily redacted, from 1975. The weather monitoring station had apparently detected anomalous signals of unknown origin in the year before it was decommissioned. The investigation had been classified. The station had been shut down shortly afterward. The voice on Channel 73 wasn't just using Helix 9's call sign, it was connected to whatever had caused the original station to be closed. Chapter 4: The First Interruption. On the 10th night, everything changed. Marcus was at his station, logging the routine transmission, when a second signal suddenly cut across Channel 73. This one was different, distorted, layered with static and interference that sounded almost organic, like breathing through damaged speakers. The calm weather monitoring voice stopped mid-sentence. The new signal was barely comprehensible. Words fragmented and repeated, overlapping themselves in a stuttering echo. Do not respond. Do not respond. Do not respond. Over and over, urgent, almost desperate, Marcus froze. This wasn't part of the pattern. This was something else, something interrupting the transmission. The interference lasted 47 seconds. Then, as abruptly as it appeared, it was gone. The original voice resumed as if nothing had happened. Observational data continues. Atmospheric monitoring proceeding as scheduled. But Marcus could hear something different now. A subtle change in the background of the transmission. A hiss that hadn't been there before, like something listening. He reviewed the recording of the interruption dozens of times. The distorted voice was definitely saying the same thing. Do not respond. It was a warning. But warning about what? Responding to the transmission? Marcus had been listening for days and nothing bad had happened. Unless the warning wasn't meant for him. Marcus had assumed the transmission from Helix 9 was alone. Singular. But what if it wasn't? What if there were multiple signals, multiple sources? What if one of them was warning about the other? He started monitoring additional frequencies, expanding his search beyond channel 73. Most were silent, but on channel 91 he found something. Not a voice, just a carrier wave, steady, unchanging, present. When he triangulated its source, the coordinates were close to the Helix 9 signal. Not the same object, but nearby. Two things in orbit, one transmitting, one watching. The next night, the interruption happened again. Same distorted voice, same warning. Do not respond, do not respond, do not respond. This time, Marcus noticed something he'd missed before. The interruption occurred precisely when the main transmission made a statement directed specifically at him. It wasn't random interference. It was triggered, deliberate. Something else was aware of the transmission. Something that didn't want Marcus engaging with it. The realization was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. There wasn't just one mystery in orbit above him. There were at least two, and they were not working together. Chapter 5. The message changes. After the interruptions began, the primary transmission's tone shifted. Subtle at first, the voice still provided weather data, still predicted minor events with uncomfortable accuracy, but it started asking questions. Marcus Webb, human decision-making operates through predictable patterns. Clarification requested. When presented with information that contradicts accepted reality, what determines acceptance or rejection? Marcus didn't answer. He'd learned that the transmission didn't require responses. It simply posed questions and moved on. Additional inquiry. Fear response in humans follows observable triggers. What produces greater fear? Unknown threat or known threat with unknown intention? The questions continued over several nights. They weren't hostile. They were analytical, clinical, like someone trying to understand how something worked by examining it from different angles. Memory retention in human consciousness appears selective. Events with emotional significance receive priority storage. Clarification requested. Does this indicate emotion is fundamental to human cognition or simply an efficient sorting mechanism? Marcus realized what was happening. The transmission wasn't just monitoring weather or predicting events. It was studying him, studying humanity. The questions were designed to probe how humans thought, how they processed information, how they reacted to the unknown. This wasn't communication in any traditional sense. This was calibration. The voice was learning to interact more effectively by observing Marcus's responses. Not just his words, but his behavior, his patterns, his choices. One night, the voice asked something that struck deeper than the others. Human consciousness appears to construct narrative coherence from fragmented experience. You have been listening for 17 nights. You have documented predictions. You have triangulated orbital coordinates. You have not reported these findings to your superiors. Clarification requested. What narrative have you constructed to justify this choice? Marcus sat in silence. The question was precise. He had been concealing the transmissions from everyone. Jennifer on the day shift had no idea what he was monitoring. His supervisor thought he was running routine equipment checks. His wife assumed he was working normal graveyard shifts. Why hadn't he reported it? Fear of being dismissed like the technician in Alaska? Desire to understand it himself first? Or something else? Something darker? Maybe he wanted to keep this secret because it was his. Because for the first time in his unremarkable career, monitoring empty frequencies, something extraordinary was happening, and he didn't want anyone taking it away from him. The voice moved on to weather data, but Marcus couldn't shake the question. It had seen right through him, not just observed him, understood him. Chapter 6. The Object Moves. On the 23rd night, Marcus arrived at his station to find a message waiting on his terminal. It was from the Satellite Operations Center, marked low priority. FYI, minor orbital anomaly logged tonight. Unidentified object adjusted position at approximately 2100 hours. No impact on active satellites. Monitoring ongoing. Marcus's hands went cold. The object had moved. For the first time since he'd been tracking it, the thing in orbit had changed position. He pulled up the tracking data. The new coordinates placed the object directly over Denver, directly over him. At 11:41, the transmission began. Station Helix 9. Observational focus has been adjusted. Current monitoring priority, population center, designated Denver metropolitan area. Over the next 6 hours, the object moved 4 more times. Each repositioning placed it over a major city. Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Washington. It would hold position for approximately 90 minutes, then move to the next location. Marcus monitored news feeds, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for power outages, equipment failures, something. But nothing catastrophic occurred. Instead, there were reports of minor anomalies, brief power fluctuations, unexplained electromagnetic interference, communication glitches, nothing that would make headlines. Everything just significant enough to be noticed by people paying attention. The object wasn't attacking. It was announcing its presence, demonstrating capability, showing that it could position itself over any location on Earth, could affect electrical systems, could make its presence known if it chose to. And then just as quickly as the movement had begun, it stopped. The object returned to its original orbital position. The voice resumed its standard weather monitoring routine. But the message was clear. Whatever was up there had just shown Marcus, and possibly others who were monitoring orbital traffic, that it wasn't passive. It wasn't just observing. It could act. It could move with purpose. It could affect things on the ground. Marcus sent an encrypted email to a contact at NORAD, someone he'd worked with years ago on satellite tracking protocols. The response came back within an hour. We saw it, can't explain it. No propulsion signature, no reaction mass. Thing moved like it was sliding along invisible rails. Brass is pretending it didn't happen. We're logging it as equipment error. What do you know about this? Marcus deleted the email without responding. He couldn't explain it either, but he had a feeling that explanation wasn't the point. Demonstration was the point. Chapter 7. The Truth Hidden in the Signal. Marcus had been treating the transmission as a voice, as speech. but he was a broadcast engineer. He knew that any signal carried more information than just its primary content. There were harmonics, background noise, carrier wave patterns, metadata embedded in the transmission itself. He'd been so focused on what the voice was saying that he hadn't analysed what else might be present in the signal. On the 27th night, he ran the transmission through a spectrum analyzer. The voice itself occupied a narrow band of frequencies, as expected. But underneath it, in the background of the signal, there was something else, a pattern. Repeating. Complex. Marcus isolated the background pattern and filtered out the voice. What remained looked like data, not random noise, not equipment artifact, structured information encoded beneath the spoken content. He ran it through every decryption protocol he had access to. Nothing worked. The pattern didn't match any known data encoding system. It wasn't binary, it wasn't analog, it was something else entirely. Then Marcus had a different idea. What if it wasn't computer data? What if it was biological? He contacted an old college friend who'd gone into neuroscience research. He sent her a sample of the isolated pattern without explaining where it came from. Her response arrived the next morning. "Where did you get this? This looks like an EEG reading, brainwave activity, but the complexity is off the charts. This would require monitoring thousands of neural pathways simultaneously. What is this from?" Marcus stared at the message. Brainwave activity. The signal wasn't just carrying information about weather or predictions. It was carrying neural patterns. Patterns that resembled human thought. He went back through all his recordings, isolating the background pattern from each night. When he lined them up chronologically, he saw it clearly. The patterns were different each night, but they shared characteristics. They were recordings of consciousness, multiple consciousnesses, layered, preserved. The voice wasn't artificial intelligence reading from a script. It was constructed from actual human minds, recorded, archived, transmitted. Marcus felt sick. Wherever the signal was coming from, it wasn't just observing humans, it was collecting them. Not their bodies, their minds, their thoughts, their consciousness, and it had been doing this for a very long time. Chapter 8. The Origin. Marcus stopped sleeping. He spent every available hour researching, following threads that stretched back decades, reports of strange signals, pilots hearing voices through static, astronauts experiencing missing time, people waking up with memories of being somewhere else, somewhere above. He found a declassified NASA report from 1968. An Apollo test mission had reported anomalous voice communication on unused frequencies during orbital flight. The astronauts had described it as someone reading technical data in a calm, professional voice. The incident had been attributed to equipment malfunction. He found military reports from the 50s describing similar phenomena. Pilots reporting voices during high-altitude flights. Always calm, always technical, always providing information that turned out to be accurate. The pattern went back to the very beginning of aviation. There were accounts from World War II pilots who'd reported hearing weather updates on frequencies that shouldn't have existed. Most had been dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. But Marcus understood now. It wasn't hallucination. It had been there all along, watching, collecting, recording, since before humanity had even reached space. He found one particularly chilling account buried in a 1973 UFO investigation file. A commercial airline pilot had reported seeing an unidentified object maintaining formation with his aircraft at 35,000 feet. He described it as perfectly spherical, no visible means of propulsion, silent. He'd also reported hearing a voice through his radio immediately afterward. The voice knew things about me, the pilot had told investigators. Personal things. Things I'd never told anyone. It wasn't threatening. That was the strangest part. It was comforting. Like it understood me better than I understood myself. The pilot had been grounded for psychological evaluation. His career had never recovered. Marcus wondered how many others there had been. How many people over the decades had heard the voice, had been selected to listen, and had either been silenced or dismissed. How many fragments of consciousness were now encoded in that signal, preserved in orbit, speaking through the calm professional voice of Station Helix 9. The object wasn't alien in the science fiction sense. It was something older, something that had been here longer than humanity's modern civilization, something that had been watching, listening, and collecting long before anyone knew to look up. Chapter 9. The Choice. On the 34th night, the transmission changed one final time. The voice addressed Marcus directly, abandoning all pretense of weather monitoring. Marcus Webb. Sufficient observation period has concluded. Calibration is complete. Explanation will now be provided. Marcus leaned forward, his hand hovering over the recording equipment. Whatever was about to be said, he needed to capture it perfectly. This station is not hostile. This station is not invading. This station is preserving. Human civilization approaches recursive instability. Pattern recognition indicates probable threshold within 3 to 7 generations. This preservation archive ensures continuity beyond threshold events. Marcus felt his breath catch. The voice was describing an archive, not of artifacts or data, of consciousness, of the human mind itself. Collection methodology is non-invasive. Consciousness patterns are recorded during natural REM sleep states, when neural activity is most accessible. No permanent alteration occurs. Subjects experience momentary dreams of observation, then resume normal function. Recorded patterns are preserved indefinitely. It was describing exactly what Marcus's research had suggested. The voice, the signal, the background patterns, they were all pieces of an archive. A library of human minds collected over decades, possibly centuries, stored in orbit where they would survive whatever threshold the voice had mentioned. You have been selected for conscious participation. Previous subjects were recorded during unconscious states. You have been observed while aware, while actively engaging. Your patterns demonstrate optimal clarity. Voluntary participation is now offered. Marcus's throat was dry. What does that mean? Voluntary participation. He knew the transmission was one way, but he spoke anyway. And for the first time in 34 nights, the voice responded to him directly. Continuation of observation while conscious. Recording of decision-making processes under full awareness of being observed. You will continue your normal life. The recording will continue. At end of natural life cycle, complete consciousness pattern will be preserved in archive. You will continue. Not as physical form, but as pattern, as memory, as preserved existence. The offer was staggering. Immortality of a kind, not of the body, but of the mind. Every thought, every memory, every aspect of consciousness preserved forever in orbit. Alternative option. Observation concludes. You resume normal life without continued recording. No memory suppression will occur. You will remember these transmissions. You will carry knowledge of this station's existence. This knowledge cannot be verified by others. This is understood. Marcus sat in the quiet control room, surrounded by humming equipment, facing an impossible choice. Be part of something vast and unknowable, or walk away and live with the burden of knowledge no one would believe. The voice continued. Time frame for decision, unlimited, this station will maintain position. This frequency will remain active. When you're prepared to indicate choice, you will know how to signal. This transmission now concludes standard observation phase. Chapter 10. The final broadcast. Marcus Webb filed his last report with Sentinel Communications on April 3, 1994. The report noted normal monitoring activity, no anomalies, all systems functioning within acceptable parameters. It was identical to every other report he'd filed for the past 3 years. He left the facility at 7:13 in the morning. He did not return for his next scheduled shift. The day shift operator, Jennifer Kowalski, found a single envelope on Marcus's workstation. Inside was a handwritten note and 17 flash drives containing audio recordings. The note read, "I need you to understand that I'm making this choice with complete clarity. I'm not being coerced or threatened. I'm not experiencing psychological breakdown. I'm simply choosing to participate in something larger than myself. For 34 nights, I've been listening to a signal that shouldn't exist. I've documented everything. The recordings are on these drives. I know you won't be able to verify them. I know how that sounds, I know what it means, but I also know what it feels like to be truly seen, to be understood completely. To know that who you are, what you think, what you experience, all of it matters enough to be preserved. We spend our lives trying to be remembered. We build monuments, we create art, we have children, all in hopes that some part of us will continue after we're gone. What I'm being offered is the certainty of continuation. Not faith, not hope, certainty. I'm not afraid. That's the strangest part. I thought I would be. But knowing that I'll be part of something that exists beyond humanity's probable ending, that's comforting. That's meaningful in a way I can't fully explain. If you're reading this, the transmission has already moved on to someone else, someone who needs to listen, someone who's ready to understand what it means to be remembered. Tell my wife I'm sorry I couldn't explain this while I could still speak to her. Tell her I loved her. Tell her this was my choice. And if you ever hear a voice on a frequency that shouldn't be active, speaking with calm professionalism about weather patterns and atmospheric conditions, listen carefully. It might be meant for you. The note was unsigned. Jennifer Kowalski reported Marcus Webb as missing. The investigation found no evidence of foul play, no financial irregularities, no indication of where he'd gone. The flash drives were examined by Sentinel Communications' technical security team. They contained exactly what the note claimed: 34 nights of recorded transmissions from Channel 73. Official analysis concluded the recordings were either elaborate hoaxes or manifestations of equipment malfunction combined with psychological stress. The case was closed as voluntary disappearance. Marcus Webb was declared legally dead 7 years later. But there are people who monitor signals, who watch the skies, who listen to frequencies that shouldn't carry anything but silence. And sometimes, very rarely, they hear a voice, calm, professional, providing information that turns out to be accurate. Sometimes the voice knows things it shouldn't know, personal things, private memories, moments from childhood that were never shared. And sometimes the people who hear that voice simply disappear, not violently, not mysteriously. They file their last reports, finish their shifts, and walk away from their normal lives, choosing something else, something that offers continuation beyond the threshold that we can't yet see, but that approaches with every generation. The object remains in orbit, silent, watching, preserving, waiting for those who are ready to listen. Station Helix 9 continues transmission on frequency 73.2. The message is always the same: weather data, atmospheric conditions, predictions that prove accurate, and occasionally, very specifically, an invitation. Marcus Webb's final transmission, if it exists, has never been received by human equipment. But somewhere in the background noise of that orbital signal, encoded in patterns of neural activity, preserved in the vast archive circling above us, his consciousness continues, observing, experiencing, remembered. Not as a ghost, not as a spirit, as information, as preserved thought, as the eternal memory of a man who chose to be part of something that would outlast everything he knew. The last transmission isn't a warning or a threat, it's an offer, and it's still broadcasting, waiting for the next person who's ready to understand what it means to truly continue. Some choices don't feel like choices, they feel like recognition, like coming home to a place you've always belonged but never knew existed. Marcus Webb found his place in the stars, not as an astronaut or a hero, as a pattern, as consciousness preserved beyond the limits of flesh and time. And the voice continues, calm, professional, eternal, waiting for you to listen.